the winter of 2014, when I was 20 and desperate enough to take any job that covered rent, I ended up in a town that barely shows up on most Alaskan maps. The kind of place where the population sign looks optimistic and the road in feels less like a highway and more like a dare. The job description sounded simple on paper. Part-time maintenance and overnight security for a church that doubled as the town's community center. I told myself it would just be a few months, a quick way to get ahead. I had no idea I was stepping into a secret the entire town had been keeping buried. Everyone there called the place the Center, even though the building was just an old two-story church with peeling white paint and a squat annex added onto the back. It sat at the edge of town, where the houses thinned out and the spruce trees pressed closer, their black silhouettes swallowed by long polar nights. The pastor introduced himself on my first day, but it was clear he was more community organizer than religious figure. He shook my hand, handed me a ring of keys that felt too heavy for such a small building, and walked me through my duties. Keep the main doors locked after evening events. Check the furnace, the boiler, the back exits. Make sure nobody is hanging around after hours. You will hear the building creak in the cold. Do not panic. He said that last part with a half-joking smile. But there was something in his eyes that told me he wanted me to take it seriously. The building itself was strange. It was old, but not in a charming way. The walls were too thick, the windows too narrow, and the hallways too long for the size of the structure. Late at night, the radiators hissed like they were whispering to each other, and the floors gave and sighed under every step. The basement was where the food pantry and storage rooms were, plus an old classroom the town used for meetings and AA groups. There was another door down there too. The first time I noticed it was during my orientation walkthrough. The pastor pointed out the pantry, the supply closet, the ancient fuse box. Then, as we turned to go back upstairs, I saw a heavy steel door sunk into the far wall, low to the ground. It did not match anything else in the place. The frame was reinforced, and a thick chain ran through the handle, secured with an industrial padlock that looked new. "What is that?" I asked. "Old sub-basement," he said too quickly. "It floods. It is not safe. You do not go in there. Ever. It is sealed, and it stays sealed." He had never looked away from me so intensely as he did in that moment. I laughed nervously and said, "Sure, whatever, not my business." He did not laugh back. My schedule settled into a rhythm fast. The center hosted kids' programs during the day, community meals twice a week, and the occasional late-night gathering when storms cut the power to half the town and people needed a warm place to charge phones and waited out. My shift started in the afternoon and ran into the night. Most of the time, it was boring. I mopped floors, shoveled snow, checked doors. Isolation wrapped around the building like a second skin. The town itself felt split down the middle. On one side were the younger families and fishermen who treated me like any other outsider. Polite, distant, curious from a safe distance. On the other side were the older folks who had lived there forever. The ones who still called it a village and ran everything from the general store to the volunteer fire station. Those were the ones who really owned the center, even if the pastor's name was technically on the paperwork. They were also the ones who tensed up whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near the basement. It started small. One evening, I was checking the pantry inventory and noticed that some of the donated canned goods did not line up with the log sheets. A few cans gone here, a box of pasta there. At first, I assumed someone had just forgotten to record what they took. People came in and out for food all the time. It was the whole point of the place. Then my own lunch disappeared. I kept my food in the old staff fridge downstairs, separate from the pantry stock. I had written my name on the container with a black marker. One night I went down to grab it, and the fridge door was sitting slightly open. Not enough to trigger the alarm, just enough to bleed out cold air. My food was gone. Nothing else, just mine. It annoyed me more than it scared me, at least at first. I yelled up to the pastor, asked if he had eaten it by mistake. He swore he had not. The volunteers shrugged and joked that someone in town had sticky fingers. I let it go, but it kept happening. Leftover pizza from the youth group, missing the next morning. My marked yogurt, gone. A half-used jar of peanut butter I kept on the door shelf. Lid off, spoon marks inside, sloppily put back. I started locking the staff fridge with a cheap padlock. 2 days later, the lock was still on, but the food was missing again. I told myself that the kids were more clever than they looked, or that another staff member was helping themselves and lying about it. The alternative, that someone else had a key and was coming into the building after hours, was not a thought I wanted to entertain when I was alone in that creaking place at 1 in the morning. Then I heard the coughing. It was a Wednesday, the kind of cold that froze your eyelashes together when you stepped outside. A storm had pushed through, leaving the air painfully clear, the stars hard and sharp. The evening program had ended early, and I was the only one left in the building. I was sitting in the small office by the front door, scrolling through my phone, when a faint sound cut through the hum of the furnace. It sounded like a cough, a dry, muffled cough coming from somewhere below my feet. I froze, listening. It came again. Every horror movie I had ever seen flashed through my mind, but I forced myself to stand up, grab my flashlight, and head downstairs. The basement was chilly, the cement floor sweating condensation despite the cold outside. The door to the pantry was closed. The classroom door was open, dark beyond the threshold. I flipped on the lights. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice echoed off the low ceiling. "Is someone down here?" No answer. I checked the bathroom, the storage room, even behind the old folding table stacked against the wall. Nothing. Finally, my eyes drifted to the far wall where the sealed door sat. The chain on the handle looked exactly the same as always. The padlock was closed. I told myself the sound had probably come from the pipes. Old buildings made weird noises, especially when the temperature swung this hard. I went back upstairs, forced myself to focus on closing paperwork, and tried not to think about it. The next night, I heard it again. This time, it was not just a cough. It was a cough followed by a faint scrape, like something heavy being dragged slowly across concrete. I went downstairs faster than I meant to, heartbeat loud in my ears. The basement lights flickered on, yellow and weak. The pantry door was ajar. I had not left it that way. Inside, several boxes of food had been pulled from the shelves and opened. Packages were torn, cans stacked in uneven piles. The same cold, damp air swirled around my ankles. But there was another scent beneath it now. Stale sweat and something sour like unwashed clothes. I backed out of the pantry and checked every corner of the basement again, my flashlight beam shaking just enough for me to notice. There was still no one there. The only thing out of place was the feeling that the air had been stirred recently, as if someone had just walked by. When I mentioned it to the pastor the next day, he exhaled slowly and rubbed his temples. "You are sure the outside doors were locked?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I always check them twice. If someone is getting in, they are not using those doors." He glanced toward the floor. I followed his gaze without meaning to, picturing the sealed door below us. "It is an old building," he finally said. "It settles. Animals get in sometimes. You are tired. Do not let your imagination run away with you." His voice was gentle, but there was a tremor under it. He did not offer to stay late with me. He did not call anyone to come inspect the basement. He just asked me to keep an eye on things and let him know if anything else went missing. The something else came sooner than either of us expected. It was about a week later when the bulk of the town gathered at the center for a community dinner. The place was warm and crowded, kids running between tables, older folks parked in their usual chairs along the walls. I was in and out of the kitchen, hauling trays and refilling coffee urns. That was when I noticed her. An older woman I had never seen before was sitting alone at the end of a table, her coat still on, head down. Her hair was a tangled gray curtain, partially hiding her face. When I brought a tray past her, she looked up. Her eyes were too bright. There was something hungry in them that had nothing to do with the food on her plate. "Thank you," she said softly as I passed. Her voice rasped, catching on the word. It sounded like a throat that had not spoken in a long time. Her plate was loaded with food I did not remember serving her. The portions were too big, piled too high. For a second, I wondered which family had taken pity on her and made sure she ate. Then the back of my neck prickled. I had seen that face before, or at least a version of it. In a framed photograph upstairs in the hallway, faded and smiling, standing next to a younger pastor in front of a half-built center. One of the founding donors, according to the plaque underneath. Except the woman in the photograph was supposed to be dead. The date on the frame said she had passed away almost 15 years earlier. I blinked and someone bumped into me, jostling the tray out of my hands. When I turned back, the woman was gone. The end of the table was empty, her chair pushed in. Her plate was nowhere to be seen. I did not sleep that night. The town moved around me like a single organism, and I slowly realized I was the only one who did not understand how its organs worked. People spoke in half phrases and shared glances. Conversation stopped when I entered rooms. The center, which had felt like neutral ground when I arrived, began to feel like a stage where I was the only one who had not been given the script. The breaking point came during the first real blizzard of the season. The wind screamed against the siding, and snowflakes hurled themselves at the tiny windows in a horizontal blur. The roads shut down, and the few people who had tried to leave town turned back. The center became a shelter that night, mattresses dragged into the classrooms, kids bundled in sleeping bags on the floor. By midnight, everyone was asleep, everyone but me. I was doing one last round when I passed the door to the basement and heard it. Voices. Not loud, not arguing. A low murmur like someone reciting something right up against the concrete ceiling. I stood there, torn between my job and the part of me that wanted to pretend I had never heard a thing. Then I gripped my flashlight, muttered that I was being stupid, and went downstairs. The voices stopped as soon as my foot hit the bottom step. The air felt thicker, like the humidity before a storm. The pantry door was closed, but the smell was stronger now. Sweat, old clothes, and something earthy, like soil that had been disturbed. That was when I saw the chain. It hung from the handle of the sealed door, ends dangling loose. The padlock lay on the floor a foot away, snapped cleanly open. The door itself was slightly ajar. There are moments when your body moves before your brain decides. My hand shot out and grabbed the door, pulling it shut with a metallic thud. I wrapped the chain around the handle, fingers clumsy, heart hammering. There was no way I could get the broken padlock back on. So I just twisted the chain as tightly as I could and stepped back. On the other side of the door, something shifted. Not loudly, just enough for the fine hairs on my arms to lift. "Who's in there?" I whispered. My mouth was so dry the words scraped coming out. Silence. Then, very softly, a voice I could not quite place, whispering my name. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran up the stairs. The next thing I remember clearly is standing outside in the screaming wind. My phone pressed to my ear, begging the dispatcher in the nearest actual city to send someone, anyone. By the time the police truck fought its way through the storm the next morning, the chain was back in place. A new padlock dangled from it, shiny and unbroken. The pastor stood beside it, arms folded, his face set in a stubborn line. "There's no one in there," he told the officers. "It is unsafe. It is flooded. You will damage the foundation if you start breaking doors for no reason." The officers looked from him to me and back again. One of them was from town. I recognized him from the diner. He shrugged, clearly caught between protocol and whatever quiet agreement the town had with itself. "Look," he said to me, his voice firm but sympathetic. "We checked the building. No signs of forced entry. No footprints outside. The snow would show if anyone had been coming and going. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you heard the storm. This is an old place." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to drag him down the stairs and force his face against the cold metal of that door and ask him if he could not feel the wrongness radiating from it. Instead, I nodded numbly and watched as they drove away. After that, nothing was the same. The pastor became colder with me, less patient. Some of the older townsfolk stopped greeting me at all. At the same time, the strange activity in the building slowed. No more missing food, no more coughing from below, no more voices. It was as if whoever or whatever had been living under our feet had gotten the message and gone quiet, or learned to be more careful. I finished my contract. I told them I would not be renewing. The pastor did not argue. When I left, he took the heavy ring of keys from my hand and removed one, just one, before dropping the rest into his pocket. I did not need to ask which key it was. Years later, I still dream about that basement. I dream about the chain, the open padlock, the door that never should have moved. I dream about the town gathered above, sleeping peacefully while something waited below them, fed and hidden and protected by people who claim to be afraid of evil. The worst part is not knowing how long it had been there. Listening to every meeting, every confession, every whispered argument through the thin ceiling of the floor I walked on. The worst part is realizing that I was never in on the secret, because I was never supposed to stay long enough to become part of it. When I think about that town now, I do not picture the snow or the mountains or the dark streets. I picture that door, that chain, that voice saying my name like it already owned it. And I know deep down that whatever is buried in that permafrost basement is not the only thing the town is determined to keep out of sight. The first time I heard the voices over the VHF, the bay was completely still and the town's only streetlight had just gone out. I was standing on the deck of a small fishing boat tied up at the dock, nursing a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching the water turn the color of steel under the midnight sun that never quite set in summer. The radio crackled to life beside me, and a voice I did not recognize began speaking in calm, measured tones about weather conditions that did not match anything on the forecast I had checked an hour earlier. At the time, I assumed it was just another boat I had not met yet. The fleet was small out here, but people came and went with the seasons, and I was still new enough that I had not memorized every call sign and captain's voice. I was working a temporary position as a deckhand and communications assistant on a research vessel operating out of a settlement so small it did not have a proper name on most maps. The locals just called it the Bay, even though there were 100 bays along this stretch of coastline. It sat about 30 miles south of where Port Chatham used to be, back before everyone left in the 1950s and never came back. People did not talk about Port Chatham much, but when they did, it was always in the past tense, like speaking about a grave. The town I was working in had maybe 40 permanent residents, most of them related to each other in ways I never fully mapped out. There was no cell service, no internet that worked reliably, and the power ran off a combination of diesel generators and whatever solar panels people could afford to bolt onto their roofs. The only communication that mattered out here was the VHF marine radio. It was how boats coordinated, how weather warnings came through, how people gossiped and argued, and kept track of who was still alive. If your radio went silent for too long, someone would come looking. I grew to love the rhythm of it. The static hum underneath every transmission, the way voices crackled in and out depending on distance and atmospheric pressure, the informal shorthand everyone used. Channel 16 was the hailing frequency, but most of the real conversation happened on the working channels. Fishermen swapping notes about where the salmon were running, the harbor master calling out tide schedules, somebody's kid asking if anyone had seen their dog. It felt like listening to the pulse of the town. That first strange transmission did not set off any alarms in my head. The voice was male, older, with the clipped cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime on the water. He was talking to another vessel about an incoming squall, advising them to head east toward calmer seas. The details were specific. Wind speed, wave height, visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile. I checked my weather app out of habit, but the forecast still showed clear skies for the next 72 hours. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was farther out than I thought, picking up a system that had not reached us yet. I switched channels and went back to my work. It happened again 3 nights later. This time I was alone in the cabin of the research boat, logging data from the day's collections. The radio sat on the shelf above the navigation desk, volume low, but always on. Around 11 at night, a woman's voice came through, asking for a position check. She gave a set of coordinates and a vessel name I did not recognize. Another voice, this one younger and male, responded with his own position. They talked for maybe 2 minutes, discussing fuel levels and a broken bilge pump. And then the transmission ended. I wrote down the call signs on a scrap of paper, planning to ask the captain about them in the morning. When I did, he stared at the names for a long time, then handed the paper back to me without saying anything. "Do you know them?" I asked. "I knew them," he said quietly. "That boat went down in 1987. I thought he was messing with me. He had that kind of humor, dry and delivered with a straight face. But when I laughed, he did not laugh back. He just turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving me standing there with the paper still in my hand. I did not want to believe him. I told myself there were a dozen reasonable explanations. Old call signs getting reused, someone playing a prank with recordings, atmospheric conditions bouncing signals from hundreds of miles away. But when I asked around the docks later that day, the few people willing to talk about it gave me the same look the captain had. A look that said I had stumbled into something I was better off ignoring. One of the older fishermen, a man named Rowan who had lived in the bay his entire life, finally pulled me aside while I was coiling rope on the deck. "You're hearing the ghost traffic," he said, keeping his voice low even though no one else was nearby. "It happens out here. Always has. You do not respond to it. You do not acknowledge it. You just let it pass." "Ghost traffic," I repeated, trying not to sound skeptical. He nodded. "Voices from boats that are not here anymore. Sometimes it is weather reports from storms that happened decades ago. Sometimes it is Mayday calls that nobody answered in time. The radio picks it up, plays it back. No one knows why. But you do not engage with it, Helena. You hear me? You do not talk back." I wanted to ask him more, but he was already walking away, his boots heavy on the wet planks of the dock. After that, I started paying closer attention. I kept a notebook next to the radio and wrote down every strange transmission I heard. Dates, times, call signs, fragments of conversation. Some of them were mundane. A man asking his deckhand to check the engine oil. A woman humming while she waited for a response that never came. Others were unsettling in ways I could not quite explain. Conversations that looped back on themselves, repeating the same phrases over and over. Voices that sounded too flat, too mechanical, like someone reading from a script they did not understand. And then there were the ones that mentioned the bay by name. The first time it happened, I was on shore, sitting in the cramped little building that served as the harbor office. The radio on the desk crackled, and a voice I had never heard before said, "This is the vessel Clearwater, 5 miles west of the bay. We have lost visual on the marker, boys. Requesting guidance." I grabbed the microphone without thinking, ready to respond. But Rowan was suddenly there, his hand clamping down on my wrist. "Do not," he said. The voice on the radio continued. "Repeat, this is Clearwater. Can anyone at the bay confirm buoy positions? We are taking on water. Need immediate assistance." My heart was pounding. Someone has to answer them. They are in trouble. Rowan's grip tightened. "There is no Clearwater out there. That boat sank in 1991. You answer that call, and you will be telling whatever is on the other end that you can hear it. And once it knows you can hear it, it will not stop." The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static. I sat there, shaking, staring at the radio like it had just tried to bite me. "What do you mean, it will not stop?" I whispered. Rowan let go of my wrist and rubbed his face with both hands. "There was a woman a few years back, a teacher who moved here from Anchorage. She started hearing the voices too. She thought she was helping. Started responding, giving directions, trying to coordinate rescues for boats that were not really there. After about a week, the voices started calling her by name, started describing things they should not have been able to see. What she was wearing, where she was standing, what she had eaten for breakfast. I felt my stomach turn over. "What happened to her?" "She left," he said flatly. "Packed up in the middle of the night, got on the next supply plane out. Last I heard, she would not go near a radio, would not even keep a phone in her house." I wanted to tell him that was insane, that there had to be a rational explanation. But the look on his face stopped me. He believed every word he was saying. The transmissions kept coming. At first they were sporadic, once or twice a week. Then they started happening every night. Always around the same time, always on the working channels where normal boat traffic should have been. I stopped writing them down after a while because the notebook was filling up too fast, and reading back over my notes made my skin crawl. Then they started getting personal. It was a Tuesday night, late enough that most of the fleet had already come in and tied up for the evening. I was on the research boat, alone, finishing up a maintenance checklist before heading to the bunkhouse on shore. The radio hissed, and a voice I had heard before, one of the recurring ones I had started to recognize, came through. "Helena," it said. Just my name, nothing else. I froze, wrench still in my hand. My pulse hammered in my ears. The voice continued. "Helena, can you confirm your position? We have you logged at the bay, but the signal is weak. Are you still aboard the research vessel?" I set the wrench down slowly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I did not touch the microphone. I did not respond. "Helena, we need you to acknowledge this transmission. Safety protocols require confirmation. Please respond." The voice was calm, professional, exactly the tone you would expect from a Coast Guard operator or harbor master. But there was something wrong with the pacing. The pauses between words were too precise, too even, like someone reading from a script they had memorized. I switched the radio off. The voice kept going. "Helena, we are showing elevated wave activity in your area. You need to move to a secure location. Do you copy?" My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the radio as I yanked the power cable out of the back. The voice cut off mid-word, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing in the cabin. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the deck with a flashlight and a cup of coffee I never drank, watching the water and trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But when I went back into the cabin the next morning, the radio was still unplugged, the power cable lying on the floor where I had left it. I told Rowan what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tight. "You need to leave," he said when I finished. "I have 2 more weeks on my contract." "Helena." He said my name the way you would speak to a child about to touch a hot stove. "You need to leave. Today. Now. Whatever is out there, it is locked onto you. It knows your name. It knows where you are. The longer you stay, the worse it will get." "What do you mean, worse?" He looked past me, out at the water. There was a kid, maybe 10 years ago. Started hearing his own voice on the radio, giving him directions, telling him to take his father's boat out into the bay at night. He did it twice before his parents figured out what was happening and sent him to live with relatives in Juneau. He still will not go near the ocean. I felt cold all over despite the heavy jacket I was wearing. Are you saying something is trying to lure people out onto the water? I am saying that the voices do not just replay the past. They learn. They adapt. And once they have your attention, they will do whatever it takes to get you to respond. I tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself that there was some kind of signal interference, some phenomenon that nobody had documented yet. But the fear in Rowan's eyes was real, and I knew he was not the kind of man who scared easily. I made arrangements to leave on the next supply flight, which was not for another 3 days. During that time, I avoided the radio. I stayed off the boats as much as I could, sleeping in the bunkhouse on shore and keeping my distance from anything with a transmitter. But on the second night, I woke up to the sound of my own voice. It was coming from the portable VHF radio that one of the other deckhands kept on the shelf above his bunk. I had not even known it was there, much less that it was on. My voice, thin and crackling with static, was talking to someone I could not hear. "Yes, I copy. I am heading out now. Should I take the skiff or the motorboat?" I sat up so fast I nearly hit my head on the bunk above me. The other deckhand was snoring softly, completely unaware. I crossed the small room in 2 steps and grabbed the radio, switching it off and yanking the battery out. The voice kept talking. "Understood. I will meet you at the marker buoy. How long until you arrive?" I threw the radio across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor, pieces of plastic scattering. The voice finally stopped. I did not tell anyone. I did not wait for the supply flight. I packed my bag, paid a fisherman twice what the trip was worth to take me to the nearest town with an airstrip, and got on the first plane that would carry me south. I have not been back to the bay since. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep. I think about the voices and what they wanted, whether they were echoes of something that had already happened, or warnings of something that had not happened yet, whether they were trying to help or trying to harm. But mostly I think about the last thing I heard before I threw that radio against the wall. My own voice, calm and steady, saying, "I will meet you at the marker buoy." I have never owned a boat. I have never been to any marker buoy. But somewhere out there, on a frequency I will never tune into again, I know that my voice is still speaking, still giving directions, still leading someone towards something I will never understand. And I know, deep in a place I do not like to examine too closely, that if I ever went back, I would hear it again. Not on the radio this time, but somewhere much, much closer. I cannot look at satellite images anymore. Not after what I saw vanish between one winter and the next. Most people think maps are permanent, fixed things, that the land underneath them does not change unless you bulldoze it or burn it. But I know better now. I know that some places exist only when they want to, and that the snow in interior Alaska can cover more than just the ground. I grew up in a town so small it did not have a high school. If you wanted to graduate, you either did correspondence courses or moved in with relatives in Fairbanks. The population hovered around 200, give or take whoever had left for the season or come back after failing to make it anywhere else. Winters were brutal, the kind where the temperature did not rise above zero for weeks and the darkness pressed down on you like a physical weight. We did not have roads in the traditional sense, just trails that snow machines packed down into something usable. There were maybe 15 other kids my age, and we ran in a pack the way kids do in places where there is nothing else to do. We knew every inch of that town, every shortcut, every hiding spot, every place the adults told us not to go. And there was one place in particular they warned us about more than any other. The snowfield. It sat about 3 miles east of town, a wide open stretch that we used as a shortcut when we were heading out to the lakes where people ice fished in the winter. From a distance, it looked like any other clearing, just a flat expanse of white surrounded by black spruce. But the adults in town had a strange way of talking about it, like they were choosing their words carefully. The snow does not settle right there, my grandfather told me once. You cross it during the day if you have to, but you do not stop. And you sure as hell do not cross it at night. When I asked him why, he just shook his head and said it was a young person's job to listen, not to question. Of course, that made us want to cross it at night even more. It was Julian's idea. He was a year older than me, the kind of kid who took dares too seriously and had a scar on his chin from the last time he had ignored a warning. We were 16, bored out of our minds, and convinced we were smarter than every adult who had ever tried to scare us into behaving. A group of us decided to ride our snow machines out to the ice fishing cabins one evening in late February, right around the time when the days were starting to stretch a little longer, but the nights were still cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. The plan was to meet at Julian's house, load up our machines, and head out around 6 in the evening. It was already dark by then, the kind of total darkness you only get in the Arctic winter when the sky is a black sheet and the stars look like holes punched in it. There were 5 of us. Me, Julian, his cousin Lydia, and 2 other kids whose names I have not spoken out loud in years. We rode in a line, headlights cutting through the darkness, the noise of the engines swallowing any chance of conversation. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, turning our breath into clouds that whipped away behind us. I remember feeling invincible, the way you do when you are young and stupid and have not yet learned that some warnings are not about control. They are about survival. The snowfield appeared ahead of us, a pale smudge against the darker line of trees. Julian slowed as we approached the edge, and the rest of us pulled up beside him. He killed his engine, and one by one, we did the same. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. "Still want to do this?" Lydia asked. Her voice sounded small in the vastness around us. Julian grinned, his face half hidden by his balaclava. "It is just snow. Let us go." He fired up his machine and took off across the field without waiting for a response. The rest of us exchanged glances, And then we followed. Because that is what you do when you are 16 and your friends are already moving. The snow was smooth under our tracks, almost too smooth, like it had been groomed. Our headlights bounced across the surface, throwing long shadows that twisted and stretched in ways that made my eyes hurt. I was third in line, keeping my focus on the red taillight of the machine in front of me, trying not to think about how far we were from the tree line on either side. That was when Julian's engine cut out. His machine coasted to a stop in the middle of the field, and he turned to look back at us. Confusion clear even from a distance. Lydia pulled up beside him, and I stopped a few feet away. The last two machines idled behind me, their engines a low rumble that I could feel in my chest. "What happened?" I shouted over the noise. Julian was already off his machine, checking the engine. "I do not know. It just died." One by one, the rest of our engines began to sputter. Mine coughed, jerked, and went silent. The others followed within seconds. The quiet that settled over us was suffocating. "This is not normal," Lydia said, and there was an edge in her voice I had never heard before. "We need to get out of here." Julian tried to restart his machine. The engine turned over once, twice, and then nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. That was when I noticed the GPS on my handlebars. The screen was spinning, the little arrow that marked my position whirling in circles like it could not figure out where I was. I pulled my compass out of my pocket, an old brass one my grandfather had given me, the kind that did not need batteries. The needle was doing the same thing, sweeping back and forth, refusing to settle. "Guys," I said, holding it up. "Look." We all checked our devices. Same thing. Every piece of navigation equipment we had was going haywire. And then I felt it. The snow under my boots was wrong. It gave too much, like there was nothing solid beneath it. I took a step, and my foot sank a few inches deeper than it should have. "Does the snow feel weird to you?" I asked. Julian crouched down and pressed his hand against the surface. His glove pushed through the top layer easily, and he pulled it back fast. "It is warm," he said. "Why is it warm?" That was when we heard the sound. It came from below us, a deep, resonant thud, like something enormous shifting its weight. The snow rippled, a visible wave that spread out from somewhere in the center of the field. We all felt it, the ground, or whatever was under the snow, moving. "We need to go," Lydia said, her voice rising. "We need to go right now." We tried to restart the machines. Julian's fired up first, coughing black smoke, but running. Lydia's started next. Mine turned over on the fourth try. The last two would not start at all. "Leave them," Julian shouted. "Double up. Let us go." The two kids whose machines would not start climbed on behind Lydia and me, and we took off toward the tree line, engines screaming. I did not look back. I did not want to see what was happening to the machines we had left behind. We made it to the edge of the field and did not stop until we were a quarter mile into the trees. When we finally slowed down, I turned around. The snowfield was still there, flat and white and empty. The two abandoned machines were gone. No shadows, no silhouettes, nothing. Just smooth, unbroken snow. Julian wanted to go back. Lydia and I physically stopped him, grabbing his arms and dragging him away when he tried to turn his machine around. We rode back to town in silence, and when we got there, we lied. We said the machines had broken down and we had to leave them, that we would go back in the morning with tools and sleds. But we did not. The adults organized a retrieval party the next day. I watched them leave from my bedroom window, and I watched them come back hours later, confused and empty-handed. They said there were no machines out there. No tracks, no debris, nothing. Just an empty field. My grandfather pulled me aside that night. "You crossed it, did not you?" he asked. I nodded. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, they were sad. "You are lucky," he said quietly. "Whatever is under that snow, it let you go. Do not test it again." I left town 2 years later for college and never moved back. But a few years ago, when I was working remotely and feeling nostalgic, I pulled up satellite images of home on my computer. I wanted to see the old trails, the places we used to ride, maybe even the snowfield. I found the town easily. I found the tree lines, the lakes, the paths we used to take. But when I zoomed in on the area where the snowfield should have been, there was nothing but dense forest. Old growth spruce, packed tight, the kind that takes a century to grow. I checked historical satellite images, going back year by year. Every single image, going back to the ESAL, earliest available footage from the 1980s, showed the same thing. Forest, no clearing, no snowfield. I called Julian. He still lived in Fairbanks, working construction. When I told him what I had found, he was quiet for a long time. "I still have the keys," he finally said. "The keys to the machine I left out there. They are in a drawer in my kitchen. I look at them sometimes and I think I am losing my mind." "You are not," I said. "Then what were we riding across, Helena? If that place does not exist, what the hell were we riding across?" I did not have an answer. I still do not. I keep those satellite images saved on my hard drive, and sometimes late at night I pull them up and stare at them, trying to reconcile what I saw with my own eyes against what the maps say is true. The forest is there, dense and unbroken in every single frame. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere, in a drawer in a kitchen in Fairbanks, there is a set of keys to a machine that never came home. I do not go home for the holidays anymore. I make excuses, say I am too busy, that the flights are too expensive. But the real reason is that I cannot stand the idea of being anywhere near that forest, knowing that beneath those trees, or maybe instead of those trees, there is a field of snow that remembers me. And I am terrified of what might happen if I ever set foot on it again. I know everyone thinks small towns are safer. But what happened behind that clinic is the reason I sleep with a chair wedged under my apartment door. I moved to Anchorage 3 years ago, and I still check the locks twice before bed. Still jump when I hear footsteps in the hallway. Still feel like someone is watching me even when I know I am alone. The worst part is not knowing who it was. The worst part is that they are still out there, somewhere, living their normal life while I live with what they did. It started in the fall of 2019. I had just finished my nurse practitioner certification and was looking for work that would help me pay off student loans as quickly as possible. A rural health organization was offering signing bonuses for practitioners willing to work in remote Alaskan villages, places where medical staff was scarce and the need was desperate. The pay was good. The contract was only 18 months, and I told myself it would be an adventure. They assigned me to a village of about 300 people, accessible only by boat or bush plane depending on the season. The clinic was a small prefabricated building with an attached apartment for visiting medical staff. It had been recently renovated, new windows installed, fresh paint on the walls. But there was something about the layout that felt wrong from the first day. Too many windows facing the wrong directions. Too many angles where someone outside could see in, but you could not see out. The apartment was connected to the clinic through a narrow hallway with 2 doors, one on each end. The clinic door locked from the inside, but the exterior door to the apartment had a sticky deadbolt that never seemed to catch properly. I mentioned it to the maintenance coordinator during my first week, and he promised to fix it. He never did. The job itself was what I expected. Routine checkups, minor injuries, the occasional emergency that required me to call for a medevac. The villagers were polite but distant, the way people are with outsiders who are not planning to stay. I was fine with that. I was there to work, not to make friends. The darkness came earlier than I expected. By mid-October, the sun was setting before 4 in the afternoon, and by November, it barely rose at all. The long nights pressed against the windows, and the clinic felt like a fishbowl lit from the inside. Everyone outside able to see me while I stared at my own reflection. That was when I started noticing the motion light. There was a light mounted on the back of the building, aimed at a small gravel area where staff could park if they had a vehicle, which I did not. The light was supposed to turn on when it detected movement, stay on for a few minutes, then turn off. But during my evening shifts, I started noticing a pattern. The light would flick on, stay on for exactly 10 seconds, then go dark. A few minutes later, it would happen again. On, 10 seconds, off. At first, I assumed it was an animal. Foxes, ravens, maybe a loose dog. But the timing was too precise. It happened every evening around the same time, between 8 and 9 at night, and it always followed the same pattern. I mentioned it to Tobias, the village public safety officer. He was a quiet man in his 40s, well-liked, one of those people everyone seemed to trust without question. He came by the clinic one evening to check it out, standing in the back hallway with me, watching the light. It did not turn on while he was there. "Probably just a loose wire," he said, shrugging. "I will have someone look at it." No one ever did. A week later, I found the first note. It was in my staff mailbox, a slot built into the wall near the clinic entrance where people could drop off paperwork or messages. The note was handwritten on a torn piece of lined paper, folded in half. "You should close your curtains before you shower." No signature, no indication of who had left it. My stomach dropped. The apartment had a small bathroom with a frosted window that faced the back of the building. I always assumed the frosting was enough, that no one could see through it. I closed the curtains that night, and every night after. 3 days later, another note. "You looked tired yesterday. You should get more sleep." This one was worse because it was specific. I had worked a double shift 2 days earlier, covering for another practitioner who had called in sick. I had been exhausted, and yes, I probably looked it. But how would someone know unless they had been close enough to see my face? I brought both notes to Tobias. He read them, frowned, and asked if I had noticed anyone hanging around the clinic. "No," I said, "but someone is watching me." "I will ask around," he said, folding the notes and putting them in his pocket. "In the meantime, keep your doors locked. Call me if anything else happens." I did keep my doors locked. I started checking them obsessively, testing the deadbolt on the apartment door, even though I knew it did not work properly. I closed all the curtains as soon as the sun went down. I stopped lingering in rooms with windows, but the notes kept coming. "I liked the soup you made last night. You sing when you think no one is listening. You should smile more. You have a nice smile." Each one was worse than the last, not because they were threatening, but because they were intimate. Whoever was writing them knew my routines, my habits, the small private things I did when I thought I was alone. And they were close enough to see inside, close enough to hear me. I stopped eating in the apartment. I started sleeping in the clinic exam room with the door locked, even though it was against protocol. I brought it up at a staff meeting, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual, if anyone else had received strange notes. the reaction was not what I expected. People shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. The administrative coordinator, a woman who had lived in the village her entire life, cleared her throat and said that maybe I was stressed, that rural life was not for everyone, that sometimes isolation could make people imagine things. "I am not imagining this," I said, pulling the notes out of my bag and spreading them on the table. "Someone is watching me. Someone has been watching me for weeks." Tobias picked up one of the notes, read it, and set it down without comment. The meeting moved on. That was when I realized that people knew, or at least suspected. And for whatever reason, they were choosing not to help. I started setting traps, small things. I left my apartment light on when I went to the clinic, then checked to see if anything had been moved. I sprinkled powder on the door frame to see if anyone had opened it. I set up my phone to record video in the apartment while I was working. The powder was disturbed. Items in my closet were moved. But the video always cut out after an hour. The battery drained even though it had been fully charged. Someone had access. Someone had a key. The breaking point came on a night in early December. I was finishing up paperwork in the clinic when I heard a sound from the back hallway. A soft scrape, like someone dragging their hand along the wall. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I stood up slowly, grabbed a pair of bandage scissors from the desk, and walked toward the hallway. The clinic door was closed. The apartment door beyond it was closed. Everything looked normal. Except the frosted window in the bathroom was glowing. Someone had turned on the light inside. I had not been in the apartment for hours. I ran. I did not grab my coat, did not lock the door behind me, just ran out the front of the clinic and down the gravel road toward the nearest house. I pounded on the door until someone answered, a middle-aged man I recognized from the grocery co-op. "Someone is in my apartment," I said, breathless and shaking. "Please, you have to call Tobias." The man stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside and let me in. Tobias arrived 20 minutes later. He searched the apartment and the clinic, checked the locks, looked under beds and inside closets. He found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. But when we went into the bathroom, the light was off. And on the mirror, written in the condensation, were 3 words. "I see you." Tobias wiped it away with his sleeve before I could take a picture. He told me it was probably a prank, that kids in the village sometimes did things like this. But his voice was tight, and he would not look at me. I left the next day. I called the health organization, told them I was terminating my contract for personal reasons, and took the first flight out. I did not pack everything. I left half my belongings in that apartment because I could not stand the idea of spending another night there. 2 months later, I got a call from the organization. They asked if I would be willing to speak to the police. Another practitioner, a man who had taken over my position, had reported a similar pattern of notes and surveillance. He had set up a hidden camera in his apartment and caught someone entering with a key. They would not tell me who it was. They said it was an ongoing investigation, that charges were being filed, that the matter was being handled internally to avoid damaging community relations. I never found out if anyone was arrested. I never found out who had been writing those notes, who had been standing outside my window, who had been in my apartment while I slept. The organization offered me a settlement in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. I took it because I needed the money, and because I knew that fighting it would mean reliving everything again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the fact that someone in that village still has a key, still knows my name, still remembers what I looked like when I thought I was alone. And I sleep with a chair wedged under my door, because deadbolts do not mean anything when someone else holds the key. My grandfather always said the snow could read you better than any friend, and that in our village, something else read the snow. When I was a kid, I thought he was just being poetic, trying to make the long winters sound more magical than miserable. Back then, the endless white felt like a blank page to me, not a record of everything that walked across it. I did not understand until much later that he meant it literally. I grew up in a tiny village on the edge of a frozen lake, a place so far off the road system that the only way in or out was by plane or snow machine, depending on the season. The lake was our highway in the winter. People cut trails across it, dragged firewood, hauled supplies, rode out to check trap lines. All of that meant tracks, thousands of them, crisscrossing the ice like veins. You learned to read them early out there? Which direction someone is going, how fast they were moving, whether they were carrying something heavy or just out for a ride. But there was one rule everyone repeated whenever the first real snow fell and stuck. Do not walk alone across the lake after dark. The elders said it like you might say, do not drink antifreeze, or do not sleep in a running car in a closed garage. Not as superstition, but as basic survival. If you had to cross at night, you took a machine and you never went alone. Ever. They never told us exactly why. Just stories that sounded more like warnings for children than anything else. Tracks changing overnight. Footprints that led out and never came back. My grandfather kept it simpler. Some things follow the tracks, he told me once when I was about 8. And some things make their own. I laughed and said that was what wolves did. He did not laugh back. The first man who vanished was a trapper named Tom. He was the kind of person everyone in town just assumed was immortal because he always came back, no matter how bad the storm or how thin the ice had been. He lived alone in a cabin a couple miles down the shore, and every winter he walked the same route out onto the lake to check his sets. Everyone recognized his boots, even from a distance. Old, patched in places with duct tape, the soles worn in a way you could spot instantly. One morning in January, he did not come back. At first, nobody panicked. It was not unusual for him to spend a night or two at one of his outlying cabins if the weather turned. But by the second day, people were worried. By the third, half the village was out on the ice, following his trail. I remember standing on the shore, holding my grandfather's hand, watching them go. The air was so clear that voices carried all the way back. I saw my uncle bending over, pointing at the snow, then straightening up fast like he had been shocked. Tom's tracks led out from the shore in a straight, steady line. Then, about 100 yards out, they just stopped. Not veered off, not faded gradually, stopped. One last pair of boot prints pressed into the snow, and then nothing beyond them. No sign of a fall, no disturbance, no broken ice. The surface around that final step was smooth and undisturbed, as if he had stepped onto a solid floor and then vanished. They drilled test holes in the ice around that spot, convinced there had to be something, a hidden spring, a weak patch, anything. The ice was over 2 feet thick, solid, safe. They marked the place with willow branches and brought everyone back in as the sun went down. I remember the way the adults' faces looked, tight and gray, like they were trying not to show us how scared they were. They never found his body. The next morning, new tracks appeared. They started at the spot where Tom's boot prints ended. No one saw them form. No one heard anything during the night. But when the first snow machines went down to check the markers, they found a fresh trail leading from that bare patch of snow back toward shore. The boots were the same size as Tom's, but the way they were set was wrong. Too far apart, like whoever was walking did not quite understand how long a human stride should be. Some steps sank deep, others barely pressed the surface, as if the weight behind them kept changing. The tracks went right up to the edge of the lake and then followed the shoreline toward town. By afternoon, the whole village knew. The trail wound between houses, pausing in places that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, even as a kid who did not fully get it. Under bedroom windows, beside back doors, behind the clinic. The prints would stop there for 2 or 3 steps, dug in like someone had stood and watched for a long time, then move on. The adults tried to act like it was just drifting snow playing tricks or kids messing around, but their behavior betrayed them. Elders went out with spruce branches, brushing over the tracks, breaking the pattern, muttering under their breath in languages my generation had not bothered to learn. That night, every curtain in the village was drawn tight before the sky even got fully dark. The next morning, there were more tracks. These were not boot prints. They were longer, narrower, almost like someone had walked heel to toe in some kind of flat-soled shoe, but deeper than any human weight should have sunk. They wove through town in loops and spirals, crossing themselves, creating patterns that made my eyes hurt if I stared too long. Wherever they passed, they blurred the tracks beneath, so you could not tell what had been there before. They did not start from the lake. They did not end anywhere. They just appeared, as if someone had lowered a huge stamp from the sky and pressed it into the snow in random places. When the sun went down that evening, my grandfather locked the door, something he usually did only as a formality. "Stay inside," he told me. "If you hear anything, you do not look out the window." "Is it an animal?" I asked. Part of me wanted it to be an animal I could understand. Animals had rules. He looked at me for a long time, and for the first time in my life, I thought he might actually lie. "It is something that reads tracks," he said instead. "And now it knows ours." That night, I lay awake listening to the house creak and settle. Sometime after midnight, I heard crunching outside, the soft, unmistakable sound of feet moving slowly over snow. Not the staccato of a running dog, not the heavy drag of a snow machine being pushed. Slow, deliberate steps. They stopped beneath my bedroom window. I did not move. I did not breathe. I waited for a knock that never came, for a voice that never spoke. The air in my room felt thick, like I was underwater. I knew with absolute bone-deep certainty that if I pulled back the curtain and looked out, something would be looking back at me. Eventually, the footsteps moved on, that same careful, measured crunch fading into the distance. In the morning, there were prints under my window, not boots. Those long, narrow marks, pressed deep, the snow around them slightly melted, as if something warm had stood there for a long time. They did not lead to the house or away from it. They just appeared below my window and ended a few feet later, like whatever had been there did not need to come or go the way we did. After that, no one crossed the lake alone, not even in daylight. Snow machines went in pairs, always with radios, always with eyes on the shore. Kids were forbidden from going down to the ice at all without an adult. It stopped being a warning and became a law everyone obeyed without question. The tracks continued for a while. Some mornings, there would be new ones circling the village's outermost houses, looping between sheds and fish racks, tracing paths no one admitted to walking. On days after blizzards, when you would expect a clean slate, sometimes a single line of prints would be there as soon as the wind died, too crisp to have survived hours of drifting. Then, one winter, they just stopped. No one celebrated. No one said maybe it was over now. We just quietly kept obeying the old rule. Do not walk alone on the lake at night. Do not give it an easy path to follow. I moved away when I was 19, as soon as I could arrange it. I told people it was for school, for work, for opportunities you could not find in a place with more dogs than people. All of that was true. But I also left because every time I stepped onto snow, I felt watched. Like every footprint I made was a line in a story something else was reading. In the city, snow does not last. It turns to gray slush at the edges of parking lots, disappears down storm drains. People do not pay attention to tracks here. But I do. I notice when my own footprints look wrong, when they seem deeper than they should or slightly out of line. I notice when the snow outside my building holds a shape that does not match any shoe I have ever seen. I still go back to visit my grandfather sometimes. The village has not grown. If anything, it is smaller. People ask me about the city, about traffic and grocery stores and jobs that do not involve fish or freight. I sleep on his couch, close to the wood stove, listening to the old familiar creaks. The lake looks the same from his window, a broad white sheet stretching to the horizon. Last winter, I went down to the shore alone for the first time in years. I did not step onto the ice. I just stood on the packed snow at the edge, looking out. The wind had smoothed most of the old machine trails, leaving only faint lines. For a second, I could almost pretend I had imagined everything, that memory had exaggerated it the way it does with childhood fears. Then a gust of wind swept fine snow across the lake, and for a moment I saw them. Not clear, not crisp like before, but there. A line of long, narrow impressions cutting across the wide blankness, looping once in a slow curve, then fading. I blinked and they were gone. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was my mind filling in patterns it expected to see. Or maybe something out there had turned a page, checking to see if we were still following the rules. When people ask me why I hate fresh, unbroken snow, why I walk in other people's footprints instead of making my own, I do not tell them any of this. It is too long a story and too unbelievable. I just say it is a habit from home. The truth is simpler and harder. I know the snow remembers, and I am not interested in reminding anything out there how to find me. I still tell myself I was just lost that night. But the road I took does not exist on any map I have checked since. I drive for work in Alaska, hauling parts and supplies between little coastal communities that only barely cling to the term town. You get used to whiteouts, surprise ice, and GPS glitches. You do not get used to a whole building disappearing. This was late October, that shoulder season where the weather cannot decide between rain and snow. I was coming back from a delivery run to a small port town and trying to beat a storm the forecast said would hit around midnight. The sensible plan was to stay in town and leave in the morning. Instead, I looked at the sky, decided I could outrun it, and pointed the truck toward home. About an hour into the drive, the storm arrived early. Hard sideways snow, wind pushing the truck just enough to make my hands tighten on the wheel. My wipers could not keep up, and the reflective markers along the road disappeared into a gray-white blur. I watched my fuel gauge tick down and started doing that quiet mental math you do when you realize you may have screwed up. I was still 40 miles from the next town when the GPS glitched. The main highway line vanished from the little screen, then came back, then flickered. For a few seconds, the device showed nothing but my blue arrow floating on an empty grid. Then a side road appeared, branching off to the right in a neat curve. A smaller line, labeled with a name I did not recognize, and a tiny fuel pump icon. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. Through the blowing snow, I could just make out what looked like a plowed turnoff, a dark gap in the endless white. The main road ahead was vanishing into a wall of storm. The little fuel icon on the screen seemed to pulse at me like a heartbeat. I told myself it was one of those private roads some of the bigger lodges kept, maybe with a generator and a tank where I could top off. I told myself that driving on fumes in a blizzard was stupider than trusting an outdated GPS. I turned. The feel of the tires changed as soon as I left the main highway. It was still snow-covered, but underneath I could feel gravel, not asphalt. The trees closed in quickly, black shapes leaning in on both sides, branches heavy with snow. My headlights carved out a narrow tunnel. There were no other tire tracks on the road. No poles, no reflectors, just that thin, pale strip cutting through the dark. I checked the GPS again. The little arrow moved neatly along the line, the fuel icon now less than a mile ahead. I should have turned back right then. Instead, I kept going, telling myself that if it looked even a little wrong, I would just turn around. The first sign was hand-painted. Fuel, coffee, hot food, it said. White letters on a red board nailed crookedly to a birch tree. An arrow pointed ahead. My shoulders loosened a little. This was exactly the kind of odd little roadside place you found out. Here. Family run, cash only, generator humming in the back. The road widened into a clearing, and I saw it. A small, square house with a steep metal roof, half buried in snowdrifts. Light glowed from the windows, warm and yellow. A tall metal tank stood off to one side, hose coiled neatly on its rack. A single porch light burned over the front steps, throwing a pool of light onto the snow. I did not see any other vehicles. I parked near the tank, killed the engine, and sat there for a second, listening to the sudden silence. Through the windshield, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Someone was home. When I stepped out, the cold hit me like a wall. The air smelled like wood smoke and diesel. Underneath that, something faintly sweet, like baked bread. I climbed the 3 wooden steps and knocked. It took a moment. Then the door opened. A woman in her 50s stood there, hair pulled back in a gray braid, apron dusted with flour. She smiled like she had been expecting me. "You made it just in time," she said. "Storm's going to shut this road down any minute." Her confidence that there even was a road to shut down should have bothered me more than it did. Inside, the house was almost painfully cozy. A wood stove radiated heat from the corner, a kettle hissing gently on top. A single bare bulb hung over a small table. There were 2 mugs on it already, steam curling from both, as if she had poured one for herself and one for someone else who had not arrived yet. A man sat in a chair by the window, hands folded in his lap. He looked to be around the same age as the woman, hair thinning, face deeply lined. He did not stand up when I came in, just watched me with an expression I could not read. "You are soaked," the woman said. "Sit down. I will get you coffee. You can tell us where you are headed." I hesitated, but the warmth and the smell of something baking were too much. I sat. The chair creaked under my weight. The man's eyes followed me the whole way. "Roads bad out there?" he asked. "Zero visibility," I said. I was starting to worry about gas. "Good thing you saw the sign," the woman said, setting a mug in front of me. "We do not get many this late in the season." Her hands were steady. Mine were not. We talked for a few minutes. They introduced themselves as William and Isolde. No last names, no explanation of how long they had been there. When I asked, they said a while and changed the subject. They knew about the port town I had just left. They knew about the storm warnings. They knew the name of the company logo on my jacket without me pointing it out. At some point, I realized I had not heard a generator. The lights hummed with that faint electrical buzz you get from grid power, but there were no lines on the poles outside. I told myself the generator was out back, muffled by snow. "You can fuel up before you leave," William said. "Cash is fine. You should not be on this road much longer. They like to close it." "Who is they?" I asked. He smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "People who do not like strangers getting lost." Something about the way he said "lost" made the hairs on my arms stand up. The woman brought out a plate of cookies, still warm, dusted with powdered sugar. They smelled incredible. She insisted I take some for the road, wrapping them in wax paper and pressing the bundle into my hand. "Long drive ahead," she said. "Sugar helps." I noticed her fingers as she did it. Clean, nails trimmed, but with faint dark smudges that looked like old ink or soot ground into the creases. The same smudges were on the man's hands, on the door frame, on the edge of the table. The kettle whistled. For a second, over the sound, I thought I heard something else, like a muffled voice coming from somewhere below us. The floor under my chair felt slightly hollow, like there was space beneath it. "How far is it back to the main highway?" I asked. "Not far," William said. "You will be back on familiar ground before you know it." He said it too quickly. The woman's eyes flicked to his face and away. I stood up. I should get going while the gap in the storm holds. "How much for the fuel?" "40, he said, without even asking how much I planned to take. I paid him. The cash disappeared into his apron pocket without a receipt. When I stepped outside, the wind had died down. Snow still fell, but more gently, swirling in the light from the porch. The tank worked. Fuel gurgled into my truck's tank, cold and real, and exactly what I needed. The house glowed behind me, windows opaque. I realized I had not seen a single photograph on the walls inside. No family pictures, no calendars, nothing to mark time. When I slid back into the driver's seat and looked at the GPS, the little road line that had led me here was gone. The screen showed my arrow sitting in empty gray space, no junctions, no icons, nothing. I did not go back to the door. I did not knock to ask. I turned the truck around and drove back the way I had come, following my own fresh tire tracks until the main highway appeared out of the dark like I had never left it. The storm hammered the truck the whole way home, but I made it. I ate one of the cookies at a gas station just outside town. It tasted fine, maybe a little too sweet. I threw the rest away. There was a faint powder on the wax paper that did not look like sugar when I looked at it under the harsh fluorescent lights. A few days later, I tried to find the road again on a map. Nothing. I updated my GPS software. Still nothing. I asked a couple of drivers who had been running that route for years if they had ever seen a fuel stop tucked back in the trees in that stretch. They all gave me the same answer. There is nothing out there but forest and swamp. Sometimes I wonder if they were lying, the way people in small towns lie to outsiders to keep their own secrets. Other times, I think about the hollow feel of that floor, the ink on their hands, the way the GPS line appeared just when I needed it and vanished as soon as I left. I still drive that highway. When the snow comes down hard and visibility drops, I keep my eyes straight ahead. If a side road appears in my headlights, cutting through the trees with a hand-painted sign promising fuel and coffee, I will not turn this time. Some places help you when you are desperate. Some places are just very patient traps. You would think being the only tourist in an Alaskan town for 3 weeks would make you unforgettable, but I almost disappeared there without anyone really noticing. I went up after a breakup, convinced that a small coastal town in the off-season would be the perfect place to reset. No crowds, cheap room, endless gray ocean to stare at until my brain quieted down. It sounded peaceful when I booked the trip. It did not feel peaceful by the time I left. The town was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. In the summer, cruise ships anchored offshore and tenders ferried people in to buy souvenirs and salmon plates and handmade crafts. By late September, all of that was over. When I arrived, the last gift shop was boarding up its windows. The only place still renting rooms was a 3-story lodge perched above the harbor, half hotel and half bar. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Marjorie, greeted me like I was a problem she had already decided to tolerate. She checked me in, handed me a brass key with a heavy tag that said 204, and told me that breakfast was at 7. The bar closed when she felt like it, and there would be no housekeeping unless I asked. "There will not be anyone else on this floor," she added, "so try not to burn the place down." I laughed. She did not. At first, being the only tourist was exactly what I wanted. I could take long walks along the shoreline without dodging people taking photos. I spent hours in the empty diner, nursing coffee refills while the waitress told me stories about winter storms that had ripped boats from their moorings like toys. People learned my name quickly. They knew where I was staying, what I ordered, how I took my coffee. It felt small and contained and safe. Then I started noticing how much they knew. One evening, on my 5th or 6th day, I went down to the bar in the lodge. There were maybe 8 people there, all locals, half of them in orange bib overalls that still smelled faintly of fish. The television over the bar played a muted hockey game. I ordered a drink, and before I could sit down, one of the men at the bar raised his glass toward me. "How was the overlook?" he asked. "Fog lifted up there, or are you still staring at clouds?" I froze. I had gone to the overlook that afternoon, a little cliff path about a mile outside town. I had not told anyone I was going. I had not posted about it, had not even taken a photo. I felt my face twist into a polite smile. "Foggy," I said. "How did you know I went?" He shrugged. "You are the only one dumb enough to walk that way in this weather. We see when you leave." Everyone laughed like it was a harmless joke. Maybe it was. At the time, it just felt like small-town awareness. People notice things when there is nothing else to do. The first real crack in that illusion came a couple of nights later. I had been at the bar again, staying later than I meant to, letting myself get pulled into a dice game at one of the corner tables. When I finally went upstairs, the hallway was dark and quiet. My room was at the far end, overlooking the harbor. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and knew immediately that something was wrong. Nothing was obviously out of place. My bag sat where I had left it. My jacket hung on the back of the chair, the bed covers slightly rumpled from where I had tossed my book that morning. But the air felt different, like someone had just been there. There was a faint smell of soap that was not mine. I checked the door again. The deadbolt was still set. The chain was still latched the way I had left it when I went downstairs. The window was locked. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went to brush my teeth, reached into my toiletry bag, and noticed my toothbrush was wet. I had not used it since that morning. I stood there in the tiny bathroom, toothbrush in my hand, heart pounding. I checked my bag more closely. My clothes were folded differently than I remembered. The zipper on the side pocket was left halfway open. My phone charger, which I always left coiled in the same spot, was lying stretched out across the floor. The next day, I convinced myself it had been housekeeping, even though Marjorie had said they did not come unless requested. I went down to the front desk and asked anyway. "No one has been in your room," she said, eyes not quite meeting mine. "We do not clean unless someone leaves." I laughed it off, said it must have been my imagination. But I watched her closely as I spoke. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After that, I started paying attention to the little things. The glass on the nightstand would be a few inches to the left in the evening. My boots, which I kicked off haphazardly near the door, would be neatly lined up when I woke up. I left my book open face down on the bed and came back to find it closed, with the bookmark moved forward a chapter I had not read. There were notes too, but not the written kind. Comments. In the diner one afternoon, the waitress smiled and asked, "Sleep any better last night? You did not toss and turn so much." She said it like a throwaway line, already turning to refill someone else's coffee, but my hand tightened on the mug hard enough that it sloshed. "How would you know that?" I asked. She looked puzzled. "Thin walls in that old place. We hear everything," she said. "Do not worry, nobody cares." Except they did. You could feel it in the way conversation stopped when I walked past. In the way people watched me cross the street, their eyes tracking me a little too long. In a bigger place, you can disappear into the crowd. Here, I was the only variable, the only new thing. I told myself they were just curious, maybe lonely, maybe bored. It worked until the night I found the room. It was raining hard, the kind of cold coastal rain that soaks you through no matter how good your jacket is. The power had flickered twice. I had gone downstairs to ask if I should expect an outage, and Marjorie had told me they had a backup generator and not to worry. On my way back up, I did something I had not done yet. I tried my key in another door. The lodge had 3 floors. I was on the second, with a hallway of identical doors. I had never seen anyone else go into or out of any of them. On an impulse I still cannot fully explain, I stopped at the door across from mine and slid my key into the lock. It turned. The door opened easily. The room inside was dim, the curtains drawn. It was not empty. A single suitcase sat on the luggage rack, half packed, clothes folded in careful stacks. On the small table beside the bed was a notebook, its pages covered in neat handwriting. I took one step into the room and read the name on the first page, written in big letters, Nathan. My name. Under it, in neat columns, were notes. My arrival date, the time I usually came down for breakfast, the length of my morning walks, phrases like prefers to sit by window and does not lock balcony door until late. There were little underlined sections. Ideal time, shower 9:15 p.m., bar crowded, hallway empty. My vision tunneled. I flipped through more pages. Each one was more detailed than the last. There were sketches of the lodge floor plan, timetables, a list titled Weaknesses that made my skin crawl. Drinks quickly, trusts staff, always alone. I felt the air shift behind me and spun around. Marjorie was standing in the doorway, holding a laundry basket. "You should not be in here," she said. Her voice was calm, but something cold and sharp moved underneath it. "What is this?" I demanded, holding up the notebook. "Why does this have my name on it?" She stared at the notebook for a long moment, then shrugged one shoulder. "People write things," she said. "Plans, stories. You were not supposed to see that." "Whose room is this?" I asked. She did not answer. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the hallway. "You need to go back to your room, Nathan," she said. "Now." I left. I took the notebook with me. I do not know why I did not go straight out the front door and keep running. Shock, maybe. Or the knowledge that the last ferry had left hours ago, and there was no bus, no train, nothing to carry me away in the middle of that storm. In my room, I locked the door. wedged the chair under the handle, and read. The earlier pages were not about me. They were about someone else. Another man, a tourist who had stayed in the lodge the previous winter. Same structure, same kind of notes, routines, habits, weaknesses. The final entry about him was short. Too cautious. Never alone outside. Try again next season. There were blank pages between his section and mine, as if whoever wrote it had been waiting. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair with my back to the wall, listening. Once, around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps stop outside my door. The handle turned against the resistance of the wedged chair. There was a pause, then the soft scrape of fingers against wood. I held my breath until the footsteps moved on. At first light, I packed what I could and left the rest. I did not check out. I did not say goodbye. I walked down to the harbor and offered a fishing boat crew half my remaining cash to take me to the next town down the coast. They did not ask for a reason. Months later, back home, I saw a news article shared online. A hiker had gone missing near that same town, last seen staying at the only open lodge. The quote from the owner said he had been a quiet man, kept to himself, went out for walks a lot. The phrasing was familiar, almost exactly what had been written in that notebook beside my name. I think about that sometimes when people romanticize small towns, talk about how nice it must be that everyone knows you. They say it like it is a comfort, but there is a thin line between being known and being studied. And the scariest thing about that lodge was not the eyes on me or the meticulous notes about my habits. It was realizing that they were patient, that I had not escaped because I was clever or careful, but because, for reasons I will never know, whoever was filling that notebook had decided I was not worth the effort. And somewhere, in a drawer in that lodge, or under a mattress, or hidden behind a panel in the wall, there is still a notebook with my name on it, waiting for the right season.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the most remote and unforgiving corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where civilization fades and something far more primitive takes hold. In this episode, we will uncover 8 deeply disturbing encounters with feral human beings who have abandoned society and embraced a savage existence in the ancient wilderness. These are not legends or folklore, but documented testimonies from geologists, park rangers, hunters, and researchers who stumbled upon communities of people living in ways that defy modern understanding. Each account has been meticulously verified through cross-referenced reports, physical evidence, and witness testimonies that paint a horrifying picture of human devolution in America's last wild places. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered, but the core experiences remain untouched in all their terrifying authenticity. These survivors have chosen to share their stories as warnings to others who might venture too deep into the mountains where humanity ends and something else begins. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the files that others tried to bury. Now let us begin our descent into the heart of Appalachian darkness. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been a park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 11 years. In that time, I have seen my fair share of dangerous wildlife, lost hikers, and emergency rescues. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the 3rd week of September 2022. What I am about to tell you goes against every official report I filed, every statement I gave to my supervisors, and every rational explanation I once believed about what lives in these ancient mountains. It started with the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in 4 days, all along the same general area near Cataract Falls, about 7 miles into the backcountry. The first was Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old from Nashville who had been backpacking solo. Her tent was found intact, sleeping bag still rolled out, but her hiking boots were missing and her food cache had been completely emptied. Not by bears, though. Bears leave distinct claw marks and tear packaging apart. This was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The second disappearance was more troubling. 2 college students from Georgia, Tyler and Amanda, had been camping together near the old logging road that cuts through Pine Creek Ridge. Their campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of dinner. Canned beans still warm in the pot, flashlights still on, but both their packs were gone and their hiking poles had been snapped in half and arranged in a peculiar pattern around their extinguished fire. The pattern looked almost ritualistic, like some kind of warning or territorial marker. By the time we found the third site, I knew we were dealing with something beyond standard search and rescue protocols. An experienced outdoorsman named Frank Costello had been hiking the same trail system for 20 years. He knew these mountains better than most of the seasonal rangers. His campsite was completely destroyed, not damaged, but systematically dismantled. Every piece of equipment had been taken apart, sorted, and arranged in neat piles based on material. Metal items in one stack, synthetic fabrics in another, food containers in a third. It was the work of intelligence, not animal instinct. My supervisor assigned me to lead a 3-day search operation with 2 other rangers, hoping to find some trace of the missing hikers before the weather turned. We packed enough supplies for 5 days just in case, and set out before dawn on Thursday morning. The plan was to follow the main trail system, then branch out into the more remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. The first day yielded nothing unusual. We found the abandoned campsites I had already documented, took additional photographs, and searched the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or direction of travel. The forest felt different than usual, though. Too quiet. In 11 years of working these trails, I had never hiked for hours without hearing the standard sounds of wildlife. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. That evening, we made camp at a designated backcountry site about 4 miles from the last known location of Frank Costello. As we prepared dinner, Ranger Phillips mentioned something that had been bothering him all day. He had been finding tracks, but they did not match any known wildlife in the area. They were roughly human-sized, but the gait pattern was wrong. Too long between steps, and the impression showed toes that were unusually spread, like someone who had never worn shoes. Around midnight, we heard the first call. It started as what sounded like a woman crying for help, echoing from somewhere deep in the valley below our campsite. We immediately grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound, following standard rescue protocols. But as we got closer, the voice changed. It became deeper, more guttural, and the words became less distinct. By the time we reached the area where the sound had originated, there was only silence. That was when Phillips found the first trail marker. Not an official Park Service marker, but something else entirely. A deer skull mounted on a broken tree branch, positioned at eye level and facing directly back toward our campsite. The bone had been stripped completely clean, but there were tool marks on it. Deliberate scraping and cutting that suggested the use of crude but effective implements. We followed a series of these markers for over a mile, each one more elaborate than the last. Animal bones arranged in specific patterns, strips of fabric that clearly came from hiking gear, and eventually pieces of human clothing hung from branches like primitive flags. The trail led us deeper into terrain that was not marked on any of our maps, through dense undergrowth that showed clear signs of regular travel. The path ended at a clearing that should not have existed. In the center was what I can only describe as a processing site. Large, flat rocks arranged in a circle, stained dark with what was unmistakably blood. Animal hides stretched between wooden frames made from saplings. Piles of bones sorted by type and size. And hanging from a makeshift rack constructed of branches and rope, strips of meat in various stages of drying. But it was the smell that confirmed our worst fears. Not just the metallic scent of blood or the gamey odor of wild meat. There was something else underneath it all. Something sweet and wrong that made my stomach turn. I had smelled it once before, during a recovery operation where we found a hiker who had been dead for over a week. Human decomposition has a distinct odor that you never forget. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Phillips grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in our flashlight beams. They were human in shape, but wrong in every other way. Gaunt and pale, with long matted hair and movements that were too fluid, too predatory. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, and they carried crude weapons made from sharpened sticks and metal scavenged from camping gear. The largest of the 3 stepped forward and made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization. It was clearly some form of communication, but unlike any language I had ever heard. The other 2 responded in kind, and they began to circle our position with the coordinated precision of pack hunters. We backed toward the trail we had followed into the clearing, but one of the creatures moved to block our path. Up close, I could see that it had once been human, but years of living wild had changed it in fundamental ways. Its teeth were filed to points, its fingernails grown long and sharp, and its skin was covered in scars and primitive tattoos made from ash and blood. The standoff lasted only seconds before training took over. We fired our service weapons into the air, hoping to scare them off without causing injury. The sound echoed through the forest, and the creatures immediately scattered, disappearing into the underbrush with inhuman speed and silence. We ran. For over 2 miles, we ran through terrain that seemed designed to slow us down and separate us. Fallen logs blocked our path at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or go around. Low-hanging branches created natural barriers that had to be navigated carefully in the dark. And all around us, we could hear them moving through the forest, staying parallel to our position but never quite visible. By the time we reached our original campsite, dawn was beginning to break through the canopy. We packed our gear in record time and hiked directly back to the ranger station, where I immediately contacted my supervisor and the county sheriff. The official report documented our discovery of what we termed an illegal hunting camp and possible poaching operation. No mention was made of the creatures we encountered or the clear evidence of human predation we had witnessed. 2 weeks later, a joint operation between Park Service personnel and federal agents returned to the site. They found nothing. The clearing had been abandoned, all evidence removed, and the trail markers had been taken down. According to the official summary, we had likely encountered a group of individuals living illegally within park boundaries who had fled when discovered. But I know what I saw, and 6 months later, when the disappearances started again, this time near Cades Cove, I was not surprised. I requested a transfer to a different park and was granted approval within 30 days. My replacement, a young ranger named Matthews, lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting his own transfer. He never told me what he encountered, but I recognized the look in his eyes, the same haunted expression I see in my own reflection every morning. The official position of the National Park Service is that no feral human populations exist within protected boundaries. But late at night, when I am alone with my thoughts, I remember the intelligence behind those pale eyes and the calculated way they moved through their territory. Whatever they once were, they had adapted to life in the deep wilderness in ways that made them more dangerous than any natural predator. I still work as a park ranger, but now in Colorado, where the mountains are younger and the forests hold different secrets. Sometimes, though, I get calls from colleagues still working in the Smokies. They tell me about hikers who vanish without explanation, about campsites found empty with all the food missing, about sounds in the night that do not match any known wildlife. And I tell them what my supervisor told me after I filed my original report. Some things are better left unreported, and some trails are better left unfollowed. The Smoky Mountains have been home to humans for thousands of years, but not all of them chose to remain part of civilization. My name is Marcus Thompson, and if you are listening to this, let me say one thing up front. I am not a storyteller. I am a geologist. That means I spend my days squinting at rocky outcrops, taking core samples and running numbers on mineral content, not spinning ghost stories around the campfire. But every so often, the world reminds you that numbers cannot explain everything. Some things belong to the wilderness, and the Appalachians, ancient, lonely, and largely untamed, hide things no field manual will tell you about. It was a late October morning in 2023 when I hiked up into the Blue Ridge on assignment. My company had been contracted to survey an area for a possible pipeline expansion, and my section included a stretch of remote, rocky terrain near the Carolina border. The locals in the neighboring town of Elmswood said little about the area except that it was best left undisturbed. Some joked about mountain lions, others about something older. I tuned it all out. I had data to collect. The first thing you have to understand about this place is the silence. I do not mean the quiet of a city park or even the hush after fresh snowfall. I mean the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you aware of your own breathing. The wind in these mountains moves in odd currents. Sometimes a gentle sigh, sometimes a cold hand up the back of your neck. The trees here grow thick and close, their roots so tangled in the old rock that when you try to cut a trail, you end up walking in circles. That morning, the autumn leaves had already fallen in great rust red and gold mats, muffling even my own footsteps. The initial part of my hike was routine. I checked coordinates, marked outcrops, and documented a few minor landslides. About 3 miles from the main road, past an abandoned fire tower, the ground pitched downward without warning. The soil here breaks into shelves, scarred by centuries of frost and flood. My boots crunched over broken stones peppered with white bleached animal bones, deer, rabbit, raccoon, and things I could not immediately name. Then I found the entrance. It was almost by accident. The map in my hand showed a cluster of limestone shortcuts, but it did not mark this. A slit in the hill about 5 feet high and 3 feet across, half concealed by blackberry thicket and loose scree. At first I thought it was just a failed fox den, but something about the geometry, deliberate, almost architectural, caught my attention. I set down my pack, flicked on my headlamp, and squeezed inside. Inside, the cave air was heavy, the temperature instantly dropping several degrees. The beam of my flashlight swept over rock walls mottled with veins of white and rusty orange calcite. About 20 feet in, the passage widened unexpectedly. A natural chamber maybe 15 feet across, domed overhead. Something scuttled in the darkness. I froze, breath clouding in the sudden chill. That was when I noticed 2 things at once. First, the scent. It was not an animal smell per se. It was wet earth, sweat, something raw and unnatural like rust and wild onions. Second, the marks. At first I thought they were petroglyphs, marks left by ancient hands, their precise meaning lost to time. But the patterns were crude, yet fresh. Long parallel scratches, shallow at either end, scored deeply into the limestone at odd intervals. There were also smudges, ashy, greasy fingerprints, and 4 old, blood-darkened handprints spidered across the wall above a nest of moss and animal pelts. I felt real unease for the first time. Years of fieldwork have taught me what is and is not a bear, a wildcat, or a trespassing scavenger. But nothing I knew lined up with what I saw here. The nest, if you could call it that, was ringed not only with tufts of dry grass and leaves, but with carefully arranged bones, most of them animal, but some plainly horrifyingly human. Fingers, a jawbone, what looked like several molars embedded in a chunk of weathered gum. My rational mind insisted I was witnessing the detritus of some deranged squatter. Maybe a small-time cult or someone hiding from the world and sinking into madness. But then I heard the breathing. It came from deeper in the cave, a slow, laboring draw of air, so faint I almost missed it. My muscles locked, time stretched out. Then deliberately I stepped back, headlamp swinging, heart kicking a painful rhythm in my chest. That was when the thing moved. The barest shuffle, then a soft grunt, not animal, not quite human. My beam caught on an eye, not the red shine of a deer nor the pale flicker of a raccoon. This was a wet, milky orb, blinkless, socketed in a gaunt, angular face streaked with dirt and tangled black hair. Its lips thinned over oversized teeth, fragments of something soft and pink hanging from its mouth. I stifled a gasp. My mind, despite everything, tried to negotiate. This was a person, after all. A desperate, starved hermit. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there? Do you need help?" My words barely echoed, dissolving in the humid dark. The being clicked its tongue rapidly, a staccato rhythm echoing against stone, its nostrils widening as if to scent me. It ducked low, frog-like, impossibly fast, hands touching the dirt as if ready to launch forward. I retreated several steps, pulse hammering in my ears. I remembered what my local contact, Joe, 60-something, lived his whole life in Elmswood, told me before I left. If you hear whistling or see shapes watching you from the tree line, do not linger, do not stare, do not try to help. I flicked my headlamp off for an instant, willing my body to quiet. When I turned it back on, the thing had crept closer, almost at the edge of the light. I could make out a twisted, splayed body, long limbs, muddy fingers, ribs showing through smudged skin. No clothes except a ragged sheet or pelt knotted at the waist. It crawled like a spider. Suddenly it screamed. The sound was nothing like a human. It started deep in the chest, then rose, ululating, hitting an octave that sent birds fleeing from trees outside. My ears rang. Instinct took over and I ran. I stumbled, lost my balance, bashed my shoulder bloody against a stone outcropping, but somehow clawed my way into the open air. Adrenaline made everything vivid, the shock of sunlight, the hiss of wind in brittle grass, the taste of bile in my throat. As I staggered back onto the trail, I heard something shuffle behind me, then impossibly a faint, mocking whistle. The same pattern I had tapped on rock as a child when I was scared of the dark. The thing was mimicking me. I ran until my legs gave out. Every bush and shadow seemed to breathe, and I found myself constantly glancing back, half convinced I was being followed. I reached half a mile down the trail before collapsing in the dry leaves. Only then, shaking, did I check my phone. No bars, no GPS signal. I forced myself to keep moving, panic rising afresh with every imagined footfall, every twig snap. Eventually, numb with fatigue, I reached my car as late afternoon light poured sideways across the mountain. I fumbled my keys, hands shaking, and started the engine. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a flicker at the edge of the woods, the shadow of something long-limbed just out of sight. I never went back. The next day, the company called. The survey was canceled, nothing further needed at my site. I told them someone was living in that cave, that it was not safe. The words felt weak, like something I should have forgotten after a sleepless night, but they have not left me. Weeks passed and I tried to forget, to rationalize. But every now and then I would get a text or call from colleagues assigned further down the escarpment. Small things at first. Missing equipment, butchered kits, GPS units ruined or stolen, weird scratches found on vehicles. Months later, Joe called me, voice hollow. "Listen, Marcus," he whispered. "They found another cave. This time there were boot prints, not just animal ones, but both. Big, human. But the rangers said they ended halfway up a cliff wall, like whoever made them walked into thin air." "What about the person?" He paused so long I thought the line had dropped. "Wasn't just one," he finally said. "There's more than one thing living up there. And the oldest folks say some of them have been there longer than the towns. Longer than people I hung up, cold and sweating." I moved back north a few months later and changed my cell number. But sometimes, especially on autumn nights just before dark, when the wind howls through narrow valleys, I smell that mix of wet earth, sweat, and old wild onions. And I remember the watcher in the cave, waiting for darkness to fall again. If there is a lesson, it is this: do not go inviting explanations for the unnatural. Sometimes the things that stare from the dark are not waiting to be found, and if you do find them, they will remember your face. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and I spent 3 summers working as an outdoor education counselor for Camp Wildwood, a residential program that brought inner-city kids from Baltimore and Philadelphia into the West Virginia mountains for 2 weeks of wilderness experience. I loved that job. There is something magical about watching a teenager who has never seen stars without light pollution look up at the Milky Way for the first time, or helping a kid who grew up in concrete and asphalt learn to identify bird calls and animal tracks. The summer of 2021 was my 3rd year with the program, and I had been promoted to senior counselor, which meant I was responsible for the overnight backpacking trips with our older campers. These were 14 and 15-year-olds who had demonstrated responsibility and wilderness skills during their first week at base camp. The backpacking experience was meant to be the highlight of their stay, 3 days and 2 nights in the deep forest of Monongahela, sleeping under canvas and learning advanced survival techniques. Our group that July consisted of 8 kids and 3 counselors, including myself. The other 2 counselors were Marcus, a 24-year-old forestry student from West Virginia University, and Sarah, a 23-year-old from Pittsburgh who had been working wilderness programs for 4 years. We had been planning this particular route for months, a challenging but manageable loop trail that would take us through some of the most beautiful and remote parts of the forest. The first day went perfectly. We hiked 6 miles through mixed hardwood forest, crossed 3 streams, and made camp in a designated backcountry site near Otter Creek. The kids were excited and engaged, asking good questions about plant identification and animal behavior. After dinner, we sat around our carefully contained campfire, and I taught them some of the Cherokee legends about the mountains while Sarah helped them identify constellations. It was around 10:30 that night when we first heard the other children laughing. At first, none of us thought much of it. Summer camps used the Monongahela system regularly, and while our site was supposed to be isolated, it was possible another group was camping within a mile or 2 of our location. The laughter was distant but clear, the unmistakable sound of kids playing some kind of game in the dark. High-pitched giggles and what sounded like a group of voices calling out to each other. One of our campers, a 14-year-old named Damon from West Philadelphia, sat up in his sleeping bag and listened intently. "Miss Isabella," he whispered, "that sounds like kids our age. Can we go say hi?" I explained that wandering around in the forest at night was against safety protocols, but promised we would keep an ear out and maybe try to make contact in the morning if the other group was still in the area. The voices continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always just at the edge of our hearing. What struck me as odd was the consistency of the laughter. In my experience working with teenagers, group play usually involves periods of quiet planning, arguments about rules, or natural breaks in activity. But these voices maintained the same level of excited chatter without any variation in tone or intensity. Around midnight, the sound stopped completely and we all settled in for sleep. I was sharing a tent with two of the girls, and Marcus and Sarah each had tents with groups of the boys. As the senior counselor, I always stayed awake longer than the others, making sure everyone was settled and listening for any sounds that might indicate wildlife in the area. I must have dozed off around 1 in the morning because the next thing I remember was being woken by Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Isabella," she whispered urgently, "you need to hear this." I checked my watch. It was 3:15. Outside our tent, I could hear voices again, but they were much closer this time. Close enough that I could make out individual words. What I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were calling out names, but they were the names of our campers. "Damon," called a young voice that sounded exactly like one of our girls. "Damon, come play with us." Then another voice, this one sounding like Marcus. "Isabella, we found something cool. Come see." But Marcus was in his tent and I could hear him breathing deeply in sleep. And the girl whose voice had called for Damon was in the tent right next to mine, also clearly asleep. Sarah grabbed my arm. "They have been doing this for 10 minutes, she whispered, using our voices, calling our names. But everyone is accounted for. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the darkness. Our campfire had died down to glowing embers, but there was enough moonlight to see the immediate area around our tents. Nothing moved, but the voices continued, now coming from multiple directions around our campsite. A perfect imitation of my own voice called out, "Marcus, can you help me with something?" Then what sounded exactly like Sarah, "Kids, wake up. We are going to see something amazing." The mimicry was flawless. Not just the tone and pitch, but speech patterns and phrases that each of us actually used. Whoever or whatever was out there had been listening to us carefully enough to reproduce our individual ways of speaking with perfect accuracy. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of investigating or trying to make contact, I woke everyone up as quietly as possible and told them we were breaking camp immediately. Some of the kids complained, thinking it was some kind of drill or test, but the fear in my voice must have convinced them this was serious. We packed our gear by flashlight in complete silence, and within 30 minutes we were hiking back toward base camp in the middle of the night. The voices followed us for the first mile, sometimes ahead of us on the trail, sometimes flanking us through the trees, always using our own voices to try to get us to respond or separate from the group. "Isabella, why are we running?" in perfect imitation of one of my campers. "Guys, wait up. I dropped something," in Sarah's exact voice, even though Sarah was right beside me. The most terrifying moment came when we reached a fork in the trail. We had taken the left path on our way in, but in the darkness and stress of the emergency evacuation, I was not entirely certain which way led back to camp. As I stood there with my map and compass trying to get our bearings, I heard my own voice calling from the right-hand path. "This way, everyone." I found the trail, but I was standing right there and I had not said a word. That was when 8-year-old Keisha, one of our younger campers who had been moved up to the advanced group because of her exceptional wilderness skills, tugged on my sleeve and whispered something that still gives me nightmares. "Miss Isabella," she said, "I can see them in the trees. They look like kids, but they are moving wrong." I followed her gaze and saw shapes moving through the forest canopy, traveling from branch to branch with fluid grace that no human child could possess. They were roughly the right size and shape to be teenagers, but they moved like primates, swinging and leaping between trees with casual ease. And they were naked, their pale skin almost luminous in the moonlight. We took the left path and kept moving, but the pursuit continued for another 2 miles. The voices became more desperate and commanding. Perfect imitations of our own voices ordering us to stop, to come back, to split up so they could help us better. They knew our names, our mannerisms, even private conversations we had had earlier in the day. Around 5 in the morning, as dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, the voices finally stopped. We reached base camp exhausted and shaken, but alive and all accounted for. The camp director, a man named Robert who had been running wilderness programs for 15 years, listened to our report with growing concern. After we had all eaten breakfast and the kids were resting in their cabins, he pulled the 3 counselors aside for a private conversation. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," he told us. "We have had reports of voices in the forest, mimicry, and sightings of what people describe as feral children for the past 3 years. Always in the same general area where you were camping." He showed us a file that contained incident reports from other camps and individual hikers, all describing similar encounters with beings that appeared to be human children but displayed impossible physical abilities and predatory behavior. According to Robert, the local rangers were aware of the situation but had no effective way to address it. The creatures, whatever they were, showed clear intelligence and seemed to understand that they were being hunted. They avoided all attempts at contact or capture, and they never left physical evidence that could be documented or studied. The most disturbing part of Robert's briefing was his theory about what we were dealing with. He believed these were children who had become lost in the forest over the years and had somehow survived by adapting to a completely wild existence. Cut off from human society during critical developmental years, they had reverted to primitive behaviors while retaining enough human intelligence to be incredibly dangerous. The mimicry suggests they understand that human communication is important, he explained. But they use it as a hunting tool, the way some predators use camouflage or deception to catch prey. They have learned that humans respond to familiar voices, especially the voices of people they trust. We never went back to that area of the forest. The camp program was moved to a different section of Monongahela the following summer, and new safety protocols were established requiring all overnight trips to carry satellite communication devices and travel in larger groups. But I sometimes wonder about those children, if that is what they were. How long had they been living wild in those mountains? How many were there? And what had happened to turn them from lost children into something that hunted other humans? 6 months after our encounter, Robert called to tell me that 2 hikers had gone missing in the same area where we had been camping. Their backpacks were found hanging from tree branches 30 feet off the ground, but there was no sign of the hikers themselves. The local search and rescue team found tracks around the area, small human footprints that led into the forest canopy and disappeared. I still work with kids, but now in urban educational programs where the biggest danger is traffic and the most exotic wildlife is pigeons. Sometimes, though, when I hear children laughing and playing outside my apartment window, I find myself listening carefully to make sure the voices belong to children I can actually see. Because I learned that summer that not everything that sounds human actually is, and some of the most dangerous predators are the ones that know exactly how to sound like someone you trust. The Monongahela National Forest covers over 900,000 acres of wilderness. That is a lot of space for things to hide, and a lot of places where lost children might learn to survive in ways that change them into something else entirely. Something that remembers just enough about being human to be more dangerous than any natural predator. My name is Jackson O'Brien, and I have been bow hunting in the Pennsylvania mountains for 15 years. I grew up in Scranton, but every November since I turned 16, I have made the trip up to the Allegheny National Forest with my father and uncle for our annual deer hunt. It was a tradition that meant everything to me. 3 generations of O'Brien men carrying on something that had started with my great-grandfather, who immigrated from County Cork in 1923. The autumn of 2020 was different because it was the first year I went without my father. He had passed away from cancer that spring, and my Uncle Pat decided he was too old to make the trip anymore. But I could not break the tradition. I convinced my 2 best friends, Derek and Tommy, to join me for what I promised would be a straightforward hunting trip in an area I knew better than my own neighborhood. We arrived at our usual campsite on Sunday afternoon, the second week of November. The location was perfect for deer hunting, a small clearing surrounded by oak and maple trees about 8 miles into the forest, accessible only by an old logging road that required 4-wheel drive to navigate. We had been camping there for years, and I could set up our base camp with my eyes closed. Derek was 29, a construction foreman from Philadelphia who had grown up hunting with his grandfather. Tommy was 31 like me, an Iraq veteran who worked as a mechanic and used hunting as a way to deal with what he called his demons from overseas. Both were experienced outdoorsmen who knew how to move quietly through the forest and respect the wilderness we were entering. The first sign that something was different came Monday morning. We split up before dawn to cover more ground, each taking a different section of the ridge system we had mapped out over years of hunting the area. The plan was to meet back at camp by noon to compare notes and plan the afternoon hunt. I was about 2 miles north of our campsite, sitting in a tree stand I had used many times before, when I noticed the complete absence of wildlife. In 15 years of hunting these mountains, I had never experienced such absolute silence. No bird calls, no squirrels moving through the trees, not even the sound of insects. It was like every living thing had decided to leave the area overnight. Around 10 in the morning, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the forest about 100 yards to my east, staying just at the edge of my sight. At first, I assumed it was Derek or Tommy, maybe tracking a wounded deer or exploring new territory. But the movement pattern was wrong, too fluid, too quiet, and following no logical hunting strategy I could recognize. I climbed down from my stand and tried to get a better look, but whatever it was stayed just out of clear view. I could catch glimpses through the trees, a dark shape that seemed to be paralleling my position but maintaining its distance. When I moved toward it, it moved away. When I stopped, it stopped. It was like being shadowed by something that understood exactly what I was doing and why. By noon, neither Derek nor Tommy had returned to camp. I waited until 2 in the afternoon, then began following the trails we had agreed they would take. Derek's path led along a creek bed where the hunting was usually excellent, but I found no trace of him beyond his initial tracks leaving camp. Tommy's route took him up to a rocky outcropping that provided a good view of the entire valley, but when I reached the spot, there was no sign he had ever been there. I spent the rest of the afternoon calling their names and firing signal shots with my rifle, standard protocol when someone gets lost or separated. The sound echoed through the mountains, but there was no response. As darkness fell, I returned to camp and built up the fire, hoping they would see the light and find their way back. That was when I heard the first response to my calls. It came from the direction Derek had taken that morning. A perfect imitation of Tommy's voice calling my name. "Jackson," it called, "stay over here." I found something, but Tommy had gone in the opposite direction and the voice was coming from an area I had already searched thoroughly. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and headed toward the sound, but as I got closer, the voice moved farther away. It kept calling, sometimes using Derek's voice, sometimes Tommy's, always staying just out of sight and leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. After 20 minutes of following the voices through dense underbrush, I realized what was happening and stopped dead in my tracks. Something was using my friends' voices to lure me away from camp, and that meant either they were being controlled somehow or something else had learned to mimic their speech perfectly. Either possibility terrified me. I made it back to camp and spent the night awake by the fire, rifle across my knees, listening to the voices of my friends calling to me from multiple directions around the perimeter of the clearing. Sometimes they sounded injured, begging for help. Sometimes they sounded excited, claiming to have made a big kill and needing assistance. The mimicry was flawless, including inside jokes and personal references that only Derek and Tommy would know. Tuesday morning, I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to search for my friends, I broke camp and hiked directly back to where we had parked the truck. The entire 8-mile hike, I was followed by voices in the forest, becoming increasingly desperate and angry as they realized I was leaving. When I reached the truck, I found Derek's bow and arrow quiver hanging from the side mirror. They had not been there when we arrived Sunday, and they showed clear signs of being deliberately placed as some kind of message or trophy. The arrows had been removed, and the bowstring had been cut, making the weapon useless. I drove directly to the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks and reported my friends missing. The search and rescue operation began that afternoon and continued for 5 days. They found Tommy's backpack hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, but there was no indication of how it had gotten there or why someone would have placed it at that height. Derek's rifle was discovered 3 days later, partially buried under a pile of stones arranged in a careful pattern. The weapon had been completely disassembled, every piece separated and cleaned, then reassembled incorrectly so that it could not function. It was the work of intelligence, not animals or natural processes. The official search was called off after a week with no trace of either man beyond the abandoned equipment. The conclusion was that they had become lost or injured and succumbed to exposure, though their bodies were never recovered despite extensive efforts involving helicopters and teams of volunteers. But I knew what had really happened, and 6 months later I got confirmation. I was contacted by a park ranger named Williams, who worked in a different section of the Allegheny National Forest. She told me that hunting parties had been reporting similar experiences for the past 2 years. Voices calling from the forest using the names and speech patterns of missing members. Equipment found arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence and planning. According to Ranger Williams, there was an unofficial theory among some of the Park Service personnel that a group of people had been living deep in the forest for years, possibly generations. They had developed hunting skills that surpassed anything modern outdoorsmen possessed, and they viewed the forest as their exclusive territory. The theory suggested that these people had learned to mimic human speech as a hunting technique, the same way some predatory animals use camouflage or deception. They would isolate individual members of hunting parties, then use their voices to lure others into situations where they could be captured or killed. She also told me that the Pennsylvania Game Commission had documented a significant decline in deer populations throughout the region over the past 5 years, despite reduced hunting pressure and ideal breeding conditions. Something was hunting the deer with efficiency that exceeded both natural predation and legal hunting combined. I never went back to the Allegheny Mountains. The following year, I started hunting in New York State, always in groups of at least 4 people, and never in areas more than 3 miles from a main road. But sometimes when I am sitting in a tree stand waiting for deer, I hear voices calling from deeper in the forest. And sometimes those voices sound exactly like Derek and Tommy, still trying to get me to follow them into the darkness. Tommy's wife received his military death benefits after the official declaration, but Derek's family never got closure. His parents still believe he might be alive somewhere, maybe injured and unable to find his way home. I have never told them about the voices that used his speech patterns or about the bow hanging from our truck like a warning sign. The Allegheny Mountains have been home to hunters for thousands of years, long before Europeans arrived with modern weapons and hunting regulations. Some of those hunters never stopped viewing the forest as their territory, and they have developed skills that make modern outdoorsmen look like amateurs playing games in their backyard. They are still there, watching and waiting for the next group that ventures too deep into their domain. And they have learned that the most effective way to hunt humans is to use the voices of people we trust, calling to us from the darkness until we follow them far enough from safety that no one will ever find us again. My name is Ezra Mitchell, and for 7 years I lived completely off the grid in the remote foothills of eastern Kentucky. I moved there in 2015 after a messy divorce cost me my house in Louisville, and left me questioning everything about modern life. I bought 43 acres of mountainous woodland for less than what most people pay for a car, built a small cabin with my own hands, and learned to live the way my great-grandfather had lived before electricity, and running water changed everything. The property was beautiful in its isolation. Dense mixed forest of oak, maple, and pine stretched in every direction, broken only by a clear creek that ran through the lower section and provided fresh water year-round. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away through difficult terrain, and the closest road that could handle a regular vehicle was a 2-mile hike down a steep trail I had cut myself. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been seeking, a place where a man could live according to his own rules and never have to deal with the complications of modern society. I had been there about 18 months when I first noticed signs that someone else was using my property. It started small. Footprints in the soft mud near the creek that were not made by my boots. Stones that had been moved from their natural positions to create what looked like primitive markers or trail signs. Areas where someone had clearly been digging, though for what purpose I could not determine. At first I assumed it was someone passing through, maybe hunting illegally or using my land as a shortcut to somewhere else. These mountains had been home to people for centuries before property lines and deeds divided everything up, and I figured I was probably not the first person to think this particular piece of wilderness would make a good place to live. But the signs became more frequent and more deliberate. Someone was harvesting wild edibles from areas I had been managing myself, taking specific plants in a pattern that showed knowledge of sustainable gathering practices. My fish traps in the creek were being checked and sometimes emptied, but whoever was doing it knew enough to reset them properly afterward. Most disturbing of all, I started finding evidence that someone had been watching my cabin from various positions in the surrounding forest. One morning in late September, I discovered fresh footprints in the soft earth near my garden that led directly to my root cellar. I had built the cellar into the hillside behind my cabin using traditional methods I had learned from books about Appalachian homesteading. It was basically a cave lined with stone walls and wooden shelving designed to keep vegetables and preserved food at a constant cool temperature through the winter months. The footprints were human but wrong somehow. Too narrow for their length, with the toes spread wider than normal like someone who had never worn shoes. They circled the cellar entrance multiple times, and whoever had made them had spent considerable time examining the wooden door I had built to seal the entrance. That evening, I decided to keep watch. I positioned myself in the loft of my cabin with a clear view of the root cellar and settled in for what I figured might be a long night. I had my hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee prepared to wait until dawn if necessary. Around 2 in the morning, I saw movement near the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest and approached the root cellar with the careful movements of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the moonlight, I could see it was human-shaped but moved wrong, staying low to the ground and using both hands and feet to navigate the terrain. The figure spent nearly an hour examining my root cellar, running its hands over the door and walls, even pressing its face against the wood as if trying to smell what was inside. Finally, it began to dig. Not at the door, but next to the cellar, scraping at the earth with its bare hands and what looked like crude tools made from sharpened sticks and stones. I watched in growing alarm as it became clear that whoever this was intended to dig their way into my food storage. This was not casual trespassing or harmless curiosity. This was someone who knew I had food stored there and was methodically planning to take it. I made a decision that I have regretted ever since. Instead of confronting the intruder immediately, I decided to wait and see how far they would go. I told myself I was being cautious, but the truth is I was afraid. Something about the figure's movements and the deliberate way it worked suggested this was not some random vagrant or desperate local resident. This was something else entirely. The digging continued for 3 nights. Each time the figure would emerge from the forest around the same time, work for several hours, then disappear before dawn. It was making steady progress, tunneling along the stone wall of the cellar toward what I knew was the corner where I kept my winter supply of potatoes and preserved meat. On the fourth night, I decided to move my observation post closer. I climbed down from the cabin loft and positioned myself behind a large oak tree about 50 feet from the cellar. From there, I had a much clearer view of what was happening, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was not alone. There were 3 of them, all working together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. They had tools, crude but effective implements made from metal scavenged from old farm equipment and sharpened stones, and they were not just digging randomly. They had a plan, a systematic approach to reaching my stored food that showed intelligence and long-term thinking. But it was their appearance that truly frightened me. These were human beings, but they had been changed by years of living completely wild. Their skin was darkened by dirt and weather, their hair grown long and matted with debris. They wore scraps of clothing that looked like it had been assembled from multiple sources, animal hides mixed with fragments of modern fabric that had probably been scavenged from abandoned campsites or hunting cabins. Most disturbing of all was the way they communicated. They made soft grunting and clicking sounds, a primitive language that seemed to convey complex information with remarkable efficiency. They were organized, disciplined, and clearly accustomed to working as a team. By the 5th night, they had broken through into my root cellar. I watched from my hiding place as they systematically emptied my winter food supply, passing containers and bundles of preserved meat from hand to hand in a human chain that disappeared into the forest. They took everything. Months of preparation for winter gone in a single night. But they left something behind. In the morning, when I finally worked up the courage to inspect the damage, I found that they had arranged some of their own food stores in place of what they had taken. Wild tubers, nuts, dried meat that smelled wrong, and other foraged items I could not identify. It was not an equal trade by any means, but it was clearly intentional. They were not thieves in the traditional sense. They were operating according to some kind of primitive social code that I did not understand. That was when I found the bones. Hidden in the back corner of the root cellar, carefully wrapped in what looked like human hair woven into crude rope, was a collection of bones that made me physically sick. Most were animal, but some were unmistakably human. Finger bones, teeth, what looked like pieces of a human skull. And they were old, weathered smooth by years of handling. I left that same day. I packed only what I could carry in my truck and abandoned 7 years of work building a life in those mountains. I never went back, never tried to sell the property, never even contacted the local authorities. I told myself that no one would believe me, but the truth is I was terrified of what might happen if I brought outside attention to whatever was living in those hills. 6 months later, I heard from a friend in Louisville who had seen a news report about the area. A hunting party had found what authorities described as an illegal campsite on the same mountain where my property was located. The report mentioned evidence of long-term habitation, primitive shelters, and what investigators called disturbing artifacts that suggested the site had been occupied for years. The hunters who made the discovery refused to go into detail about what they had seen, but one of them was quoted as saying that whoever had been living there was not living by any rules that civilized people would recognize. The investigation was turned over to federal authorities, and as far as I know, no results were ever made public. I live in a suburban apartment now, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and all the complications of modern life I once tried to escape. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I remember the sound of those primitive voices communicating in the darkness, and the careful way they had arranged their offerings in place of the food they took. I think about the bones wrapped in human hair, and I wonder how many other people had tried to build lives in those remote mountains over the years. How many had encountered the same beings I met, and how many had made different choices about how to handle the situation. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived and long before property deeds and modern law divided everything up into neat parcels. Some of those people never joined the modern world, never learned to live according to civilized rules, never stopped viewing the mountains as their territory and everyone else as intruders. They are still there, living according to ancient codes and defending their territory in ways that most people would never understand. And they are patient, watching and waiting for the next person who thinks they can build a life in the deep wilderness without understanding what else calls those mountains home. My name is Autumn Hayes, and I work as a meteorologist for the National Weather Service office in Little Rock, Arkansas. My specialty is severe weather prediction and storm tracking, which means I spend a lot of time in remote locations setting up monitoring equipment and collecting atmospheric data. Most of my field work is routine, but the assignment that took me into the Ozark Mountains in March of 2022 became something that no amount of scientific training could have prepared me for. I was part of a two-person team investigating an unusual weather pattern that had been developing over the Arkansas-Missouri border region. Satellite imagery showed atmospheric disturbances that did not match any known meteorological phenomena, and ground-based radar was picking up anomalies that suggested significant storm activity in areas where local weather stations were reporting clear skies. My partner was Dr. James Crawford, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arkansas who specialized in rare weather events. We drove up into the mountains on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the forest was just beginning to show the first signs of spring. The assignment was supposed to take 3 days, setting up temporary monitoring stations and collecting baseline data to help explain the satellite anomalies. The first 2 days went smoothly. We established monitoring stations at 3 different elevations, collected soil temperature readings, and documented local topographical features that might be affecting air currents. The equipment was functioning perfectly, and we were getting consistent readings that should have helped explain the unusual satellite data. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. We woke up to weather conditions that should have been impossible given the forecast. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color that I had only seen once before, during a tornado outbreak in Oklahoma. The barometric pressure was dropping faster than anything our instruments could properly measure, and the temperature had fallen 30 degrees since midnight. Dr. Crawford checked our equipment 3 times, convinced there was a malfunction. According to every predictive model we had access to, the conditions we were experiencing could not exist in this geographic region during this time of year. The atmospheric pressure reading suggested we were in the path of a Category 3 hurricane, but we were 600 miles from the nearest ocean and 1,500 feet above sea level. Around noon, the storm hit with a ferocity that defied explanation. Winds that our anemometer measured at over 90 miles per hour before the device was destroyed by flying debris. Rain that fell so hard it was difficult to breathe if you faced into it. Lightning strikes that seemed to target metallic objects with deliberate precision, destroying 2 of our monitoring stations in the first hour. We took shelter in our research van, but it quickly became clear that the vehicle would not provide adequate protection. The storm was not moving in any predictable pattern. Instead of passing through the area like a normal weather system, it seemed to be circling our position, creating a localized vortex of destructive weather that had no basis in atmospheric science. By 3 in the afternoon, a pine tree the size of a telephone pole crashed across the road behind us, blocking our escape route. Dr. Crawford made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed a cave opening about half a mile up the mountainside and suggested we abandon the van and seek shelter there until the storm passed. We grabbed our emergency supplies and fought our way through horizontal rain and debris to reach the cave entrance. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for several people, and extended back into the mountain far enough that we could escape the noise and fury of the storm outside. But we were not alone in that cave. As we moved deeper into the darkness, our flashlights revealed clear signs of recent habitation. A fire pit with warm ashes, sleeping areas made from animal hides and moss, and crude tools fashioned from stone and scavenged metal. Most disturbing of all was the smell, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. Dr. Crawford wanted to leave immediately and find shelter elsewhere, but the storm outside had intensified to the point where venturing back into it would have been suicidal. We positioned ourselves near the cave entrance, close enough to escape quickly if necessary, but far enough inside to be protected from the weather. That was when we heard the voices. At first, they seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave system, soft murmuring that could have been wind moving through underground passages. But gradually, the sounds became more distinct, and we realized we were listening to human conversation in a language neither of us recognized. The voices grew louder and closer, and eventually we could see flickering light from deeper in the cave that suggested someone was approaching with torches or fire. Dr. Crawford and I pressed ourselves against the cave wall, hoping to remain hidden until whoever it was had passed by. What emerged from the depths of that cave still appears in my nightmares. 3 figures that had once been human but had been changed by years of living in complete isolation from civilization. They moved with the fluid grace of people who had adapted to navigating underground passages in total darkness, and their eyes reflected our flashlight beams like those of nocturnal animals. They wore clothing made from animal skins and plant fibers, primitive but expertly crafted. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight, but tough and scarred from years of harsh living. Most unsettling of all was their reaction to our presence. They showed no surprise at finding strangers in their cave, as if they had been expecting us. The largest of the 3, a man who might have been 50 or 70 years old, stepped forward and spoke to us in perfect English. "Storm brought you here," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Storm always brings the lost ones to us." He gestured toward the cave entrance where rain was still pounding the mountainside. "Been waiting 3 days for this one to build, right?" Dr. Crawford tried to explain that we were scientists conducting weather research, that we had equipment and colleagues who would be looking for us. The man listened patiently, then smiled with teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "No equipment works when the mountain calls the storm," he said. "Been calling storms for longer than your people been keeping weather records." That was when I understood that the atmospheric anomalies we had been sent to investigate were not natural phenomena. These people, whoever they were, had somehow learned to manipulate local weather patterns. The impossible storm conditions, the localized vortex, the equipment malfunctions, all of it was being controlled by human intelligence that had developed capabilities beyond anything modern science recognized. The 3 figures seemed to be debating something among themselves in their strange language, occasionally glancing at us and gesturing toward different parts of the cave. Finally, the leader turned back to us and made an offer that chilled me to the bone. "Storm will pass by morning," he said. "You can leave then. Go back to your flatland people and your machines that measure what they cannot understand. Or you can stay. Learn the old ways, become part of the mountain family that keeps the ancient knowledge alive." When we indicated that we wanted to leave, his expression darkened. "Mountain does not like to let go of those who have seen too much," he warned. "Your weather machines will never work right again. Your predictions will fail when the mountain decides to call storms, and someday when you least expect it, another storm will bring you back to us." We spent that night huddled near the cave entrance, listening to the voices of the cave dwellers echoing from deep underground, and watching the impossible storm continue to rage outside. By morning, the weather had cleared completely, revealing a landscape that looked like it had been hit by a tornado despite the complete absence of any rotating wind patterns. Our research van was destroyed, crushed by falling trees and battered by hailstones the size of golf balls. Most of our equipment was either missing or damaged beyond repair. We hiked back to the main road and were picked up by a search and rescue team that had been looking for us since we failed to check in the previous evening. The official report documented equipment failure due to unexpected severe weather, with no mention of the cave dwellers or their claims about controlling storms. Dr. Crawford requested a transfer to a different research program within 6 months and now works exclusively with computer models and satellite data. He has never returned to field research, but the cave dwellers' warning proved accurate. Over the past 2 years, my weather predictions have become increasingly unreliable, particularly when it comes to storm systems that develop over mountainous terrain. Equipment that worked perfectly for years now malfunctions at critical moments, and I find myself unable to explain atmospheric phenomena that should be routine to analyze. 3 months ago, I was tracking a storm system that was moving toward the Ozark region when it suddenly changed direction and intensity in ways that violated every principle of meteorology I had ever learned. The storm moved in a perfect circle around a specific mountain peak, maintaining Category 2 hurricane force winds for 6 hours before dissipating completely. That mountain peak was less than 10 miles from the cave where we had taken shelter. According to satellite data, the storm should have been impossible. According to my instruments, it should not have existed at all. But according to local residents who have lived in those mountains for generations, it was just another spring storm, no different from dozens of others they had witnessed over the years. I still work as a meteorologist, but I no longer trust the science that once seemed so reliable. Weather patterns in mountainous regions follow rules that are not written in any textbook, controlled by people who have learned to work with atmospheric forces in ways that make our most advanced technology look like children's toys. The Ozark Mountains have been home to human communities for thousands of years, long before weather satellites and computer models attempted to predict and control the forces of nature. Some of those communities never forgot the old ways of reading signs in the sky and calling storms when they were needed. They are still there, living in caves and underground passages, maintaining knowledge that modern science has dismissed as impossible. And sometimes, when atmospheric conditions are right, and the mountain decides it needs new members, they send storms to guide the lost ones to their door. My name is Phoenix Anderson, and I have been a professional wilderness photographer for over a decade. My specialty is capturing the raw beauty of American forests during extreme weather conditions, particularly winter scenes when the landscape transforms into something almost otherworldly. The assignment that brought me to the Appalachian Trail in February of 2023 was supposed to be the culmination of my career. A month-long photography expedition documenting winter wildlife adaptation in the most remote sections of the trail system. I had planned the trip for 2 years, studying weather patterns, wildlife migration routes, and topographical features to identify the most promising locations for capturing unique images. My route would take me through sections of the trail in Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, focusing on high elevation areas where snow and ice create the most dramatic photographic opportunities. The expedition began in Shenandoah National Park on February 3rd, when temperatures were hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit and fresh snow had fallen for 3 consecutive days. Perfect conditions for the stark, minimalist compositions I was hoping to capture. I was carrying winter camping gear rated for temperatures down to -20 degrees, plus over 40 pounds of camera equipment designed to function in extreme cold. For the first week, everything went according to plan. I captured images of frozen waterfalls, snow-laden branches creating natural sculptures, and wildlife tracks crisscrossing pristine white landscapes. The cold was brutal but manageable with proper clothing and shelter. I was averaging about 8 miles per day, stopping frequently to set up shots and waiting for optimal lighting conditions. It was during the second week, as I entered a particularly remote section of trail in West Virginia, that I began finding the unusual tracks. At first, I thought they were made by a large dog or possibly a wolf, though wolves had been extinct in this region for over a century. The prints were roughly canine in shape, but significantly larger than any domestic dog breed, with claw marks that extended unusually far from the toe pads. But as I studied the tracks more carefully, photographing them for documentation purposes, I realized they showed characteristics that did not match any known animal. The gait pattern was wrong for a quadruped, showing irregularities that suggested the creature sometimes walked on 2 legs rather than 4. The depth and distribution of weight suggested something much heavier than any dog or wolf, yet the tracks showed intelligence in their placement, deliberately avoiding areas where they would be easily spotted. I followed the tracks for over 2 miles, fascinated by the photographic opportunities they presented, and curious about what kind of animal could be creating such unusual prints. The trail led me off the main Appalachian Trail onto what appeared to be an old logging road that had been abandoned for decades. The tracks became more numerous here, joined by others that suggested I was following not just one creature, but several. The logging road ended at what had once been a clear-cut area, now partially reforested with young trees and dense underbrush. In the center of this clearing was a structure that defied immediate explanation. It appeared to be some kind of shelter, but constructed using techniques I had never seen before. Large logs had been arranged in a complex pattern, partially buried in the earth, with spaces between them filled with smaller branches, leaves, and what looked like animal fur. But it was the size of the structure that truly shocked me. This was not a simple lean-to or hunting blind. It was easily 20 feet in diameter and appeared to extend underground, as if the visible portion was only the upper level of a much larger dwelling. Most disturbing of all was the smell emanating from inside, a mixture of rotting meat, unwashed bodies, and something else that made my stomach turn. I approached cautiously, camera ready, professional curiosity overcoming the growing sense of unease I was feeling. The entrance to the structure was partially hidden by hanging strips of bark and animal hide, but I could see that it opened into a much larger space than the exterior suggested. I took several photographs of the construction, noting the sophisticated engineering involved in creating such a stable shelter using only natural materials. That was when I heard the breathing, deep rhythmic exhalations coming from somewhere inside the structure, too loud and too slow to be coming from any normal-sized animal. I froze, camera still raised, trying to process what I was hearing. Whatever was inside that shelter was large, and it was awake. The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by sounds of movement, scraping and shuffling that suggested something large was rising to its feet. I backed away from the entrance, instinct screaming at me to run, but professional habit kept me focused on documenting what I was witnessing. What emerged from that winter den still haunts my nightmares. It was humanoid in basic shape, but changed by years of adaptation to extreme cold and harsh living conditions. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be a combination of matted hair and animal fur that had been deliberately attached to its skin. Its face was human enough to be recognizable, but distorted by malnutrition, frostbite damage, and primitive modifications, including filed teeth and scarification. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that terrified me most. This was not some mindless beast or person driven insane by isolation. This was a human being who had chosen to live like this, who had adapted to surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. It studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, taking in my modern winter gear, my expensive camera equipment, my obvious status as an outsider. Then it made a sound that was part growl, part vocalization, clearly some form of communication directed not at me, but at others I could not see. The response was immediate. 3 more figures emerged from the den, each showing similar adaptations to extreme cold survival, but obviously part of the same family or clan group. They moved with coordinated precision, spreading out to surround my position with the practiced efficiency of pack hunters. The largest of the group, the one who had emerged first, stepped forward and spoke to me in English that was heavily accented and difficult to understand, but unmistakably human language. "You take pictures," it said, gesturing toward my camera. "Show other people where we live." The statement was not a question, but an accusation delivered with absolute certainty. I tried to explain that I was documenting wildlife and natural landscapes, that I had no intention of revealing their location or even mentioning their existence. But even as I spoke, I realized how hollow my words sounded. I was a professional photographer, and my entire career was built on sharing images of remote wilderness areas with the outside world. "Wintertime," the creature continued, "nobody comes to mountain. We sleep, save energy, wait for warm time. You bring other people, make us move again. Always moving, always hiding, never safe." That was when I understood what I was looking at. These were not people who had recently become lost or abandoned civilization. This was a family that had been living wild for generations, adapting to seasonal patterns that included winter hibernation-like behavior that allowed them to survive in conditions that would kill anyone unprepared for the extreme cold. The smaller figures were children, I realized, though their exact ages were impossible to determine due to their primitive lifestyle and adaptive modifications. They watched me with the same intelligent wariness as the adults, clearly understanding the threat that my presence represented to their survival. "Camera," the leader demanded, holding out a hand that was more claw than finger. "Give pictures." I had 2 choices: comply with their demands and lose weeks of work, or attempt to escape with my equipment and probably die in the process. These people had survived in conditions that challenged every limit of human endurance, and they knew this terrain better than any modern outdoorsman ever could. I handed over my camera memory cards, watching as the leader examined them briefly before passing them to one of the others, who disappeared back into the den. "We keep pictures," he said. "You go away. Never come back. Never tell people about Mountain Family." The message was delivered without obvious threat, but the implications were clear. They had dealt with unwanted discovery before, and they had methods for ensuring their continued secrecy. I was being allowed to leave because cooperation was preferable to the alternatives, but that cooperation was not negotiable. I left immediately, hiking back to the main trail and gathering darkness without stopping to set up camp. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees that night, and I barely survived despite having equipment rated for extreme cold. These people were living through conditions that nearly killed me even with modern winter survival gear. I completed my photography expedition but never developed or published any of the images that might have revealed the location of the winter den. The memory cards I had surrendered contained weeks of work, including some of the best winter wilderness photographs I had ever captured. But I never attempted to retrieve them or return to the area. 6 months later, I read a news report about search and rescue operations in the same area of West Virginia where I had encountered the hibernating family. 3 separate hiking parties had reported equipment theft and what they described as stalking behavior by unknown individuals. Local authorities concluded that the incidents were probably the work of drug manufacturers using remote locations for illegal operations. But I knew better. The Mountain family was protecting their territory during the active season, using techniques that kept them hidden while discouraging others from exploring too deeply into their domain. They were not criminals or madmen, but survivors who had learned to live according to natural patterns that most people had forgotten centuries ago. I still work as a wilderness photographer, but I no longer seek out the most remote and extreme locations. I have learned that some places are meant to remain hidden, and some adaptations to harsh environments come at costs that civilized people cannot imagine. The Appalachian Mountains have been home to human beings for thousands of years, including people who chose to remain wild when others moved toward civilization. They are still there, following seasonal patterns that include winter dormancy periods that allow them to survive conditions that would kill most modern humans. They are patient, intelligent, and absolutely committed to remaining hidden from a world that would either exploit them or try to save them from a life they have chosen. And they have learned that the best way to maintain their secrecy is to ensure that anyone who discovers them understands the importance of keeping that discovery private. My name is River Blackwood, and I have spent the last 17 years working as a forestry specialist for the United States Forest Service. My job involves surveying remote woodland areas, documenting biodiversity, and assessing the health of old-growth forest systems that have remained largely untouched by human development. It is work that has taken me into some of the most pristine and isolated wilderness areas in the southeastern United States, places where the trees have been growing undisturbed for centuries. In October of 2021, I was assigned to conduct a comprehensive survey of an old-growth section of Cherokee National Forest that had been designated for potential inclusion in a protected wilderness area. The site was located in a remote valley approximately 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, accessible only by hiking trails that had not been maintained for over a decade. The assignment was supposed to take 1 week, documenting tree species, measuring trunk diameters, and photographing unusual specimens for the official report. I had completed similar surveys dozens of times before, and this particular location had been recommended by my supervisor as one of the most spectacular examples of virgin forest remaining in North Carolina. What made this forest different from other old-growth areas I had surveyed was the sheer age and size of the trees. Some of the chestnut oaks and tulip poplars were clearly over 400 years old, with trunk diameters exceeding 6 feet. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, very little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight that felt ancient and primordial. But it was the silence that first made me uneasy. In 17 years of forest work, I had never experienced such complete absence of wildlife sounds. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. The forest felt empty in a way that violated everything I knew about healthy ecosystem dynamics. On my second day in the area, I began finding the markings. At first, I thought they were natural scarring from lightning strikes or disease, but closer examination revealed deliberate patterns carved into the bark of specific trees. The marks were old, weathered by years of exposure, but clearly made by tools rather than natural processes. The markings appeared to be territorial markers of some kind, carved at precise intervals along what seemed to be established trails through the forest. Each marked tree displayed the same symbol, a spiral pattern that started small at the base and grew larger as it wound upward around the trunk. Following these trail markers led me deeper into the forest than my original survey area required. But scientific curiosity compelled me to document what appeared to be evidence of historical human habitation in an area that was supposed to be pristine wilderness. The trail markers led to a clearing that should not have existed. According to topographical maps and aerial photography, this section of forest was continuous canopy with no natural openings. But there it was, a perfectly circular clearing about 200 feet in diameter, completely hidden from above by an interwoven canopy of branches that had been deliberately trained to grow together. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied every principle of forest conservation I had been trained to uphold. It was a dwelling built entirely from living trees, their trunks and branches shaped and guided over years to create walls, roof, and floor without killing the trees themselves. The structure was still alive, still growing, with leaves and new growth emerging from every surface. The craftsmanship was beyond anything I had ever seen. Whoever had created this living building possessed knowledge of tree biology and growth patterns that exceeded anything taught in modern forestry programs. They had convinced dozens of trees to grow in precise directions, their branches interweaving to create spaces that were both architecturally sound and biologically healthy. But the dwelling was not empty. As I approached to examine the construction more closely, I realized that people were living inside the treehouse. I could see movement through gaps in the living walls and smell wood smoke from a fire that must have been burning somewhere within the structure. I called out, identifying myself as a Forest Service employee and explaining that I was conducting a routine survey. The response was immediate and terrifying. The forest around me suddenly exploded with movement as figures emerged from camouflaged positions I had not even noticed. They had been watching me since I entered the clearing, possibly since I first found the trail markers. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women of various ages, all dressed in clothing made from forest materials and moving with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire lives in the wilderness. But what struck me most was their appearance. These were not primitive people struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They were healthy, well-nourished, and clearly thriving in their forest environment. Their skin was darkened by sun and weather, their hair was long and adorned with feathers and plant materials. But their eyes showed intelligence and organization that suggested a sophisticated society. The apparent leader of the group was a woman who might have been 60 years old, with silver hair braided with vines and wearing a cloak made from what looked like living moss. She approached me without fear or aggression, studying me with the same scientific curiosity I was directing toward her and her people. "You are the tree counter," she said in perfect English, though her accent was unlike anything I had ever heard. "We have been watching your people measure our forest for 3 days now." I tried to explain that I was conducting a biodiversity survey, that my work was aimed at protecting the forest from development. She listened patiently, then gestured toward the living dwelling behind her. "We have been protecting this forest for 7 generations," she said. "Our ancestors learned to live with the trees instead of cutting them down, to build with growing wood instead of dead lumber. Your people want to protect the forest by keeping humans away from it. We protect it by becoming part of it." She explained that her community had been living in this valley since before the Cherokee Nation was forced to relocate, that they had chosen to remain hidden rather than join the removal to Oklahoma. Over the generations, they had developed techniques for forest living that left no trace on the ecosystem while providing everything they needed for a sustainable lifestyle. The living architecture was just one example of their innovations. They had learned to cultivate wild plants in ways that increased biodiversity rather than reducing it, to hunt and fish using methods that strengthened animal populations rather than depleting them, and to create tools and clothing from forest materials without damaging the sources. But they also made it clear that their survival depended on remaining hidden from the outside world. Government agencies, environmental groups, and commercial interests would all pose threats to their way of life if their existence became known. They had survived by ensuring that anyone who discovered their community understood the importance of keeping their secret. "Your survey will recommend that this area be protected," the woman continued. "That is good. But your report will not mention us, and you will not return here again. We have ways of making sure the forest keeps its secrets, and we have used those ways before when necessary." The threat was delivered without hostility, but with absolute certainty. These people had remained hidden for over a century, and had clearly developed methods for dealing with unwanted discovery. I had no doubt that they possessed both the knowledge and the will to eliminate any threat to their security. I spent the rest of that day being shown through their community, observing construction techniques and forest management practices that revolutionized my understanding of sustainable living. They had created a civilization that existed in perfect harmony with the natural environment, taking only what they needed and giving back more than they consumed. Their knowledge of plant biology, animal behavior, and ecological relationships exceeded anything I had learned in graduate school or 17 years of professional experience. They knew things about forest ecosystems that modern science had not yet discovered, and they had used that knowledge to create a way of life that was both primitive and incredibly sophisticated. But they also made it clear that this knowledge would not be shared with the outside world. Their survival depended on remaining hidden, and they had learned through bitter experience that contact with modern civilization meant destruction of their way of life. I left the next morning with a complete understanding of why this forest had seemed so empty of wildlife. The animals were there, but they had learned to hide from human observers. The forest dwellers had trained them to avoid contact with outsiders, creating an illusion of emptiness that helped protect the community's secret. My official report recommended the area for wilderness protection based on the exceptional size and age of the old-growth trees. I made no mention of the human community or their remarkable innovations in sustainable forest living. As far as the Forest Service is concerned, the valley contains nothing but trees. But sometimes when I am conducting surveys in other remote forest areas, I find myself looking for signs of similar communities. I study unusual tree growth patterns and wonder if they might be evidence of living architecture. I listen for the absence of wildlife sounds that might indicate human habitation designed to remain hidden. The Cherokee National Forest covers over 600,000 acres of wilderness, much of it never fully explored or documented. There is room in that vast expanse for communities that have learned to live without leaving traces. People who have chosen to remain part of the natural world rather than trying to dominate it. They are still there, protecting the forest by becoming one with it, maintaining knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of sustainable living. But that knowledge will remain hidden as long as the outside world continues to view wilderness as something to be either exploited or preserved, rather than something to live with as equals.